12 motorcycles idled in a storm-drowned parking lot while a hungry 8-year-old girl whispered 4 words that changed everything. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for leftovers. But when her hoodie slipped off her shoulder, what a battle-scarred biker saw written across her skin wasn't just bruises. It was a system. Numbers. Tally marks. A punishment chart carved into living flesh by someone the law trusted to protect her. That night, 12 men who had buried friends, survived wars, and carried wounds no hospital could stitch made a decision that would put them on a collision course with money, power, and a man who believed children were property. Nobody was ready for what came next. If this story hits you, stay until the very end. Drop a like right now. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. And let's ride this one together. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when the last motorcycle turned into the gravel lot of Mabel's roadside diner off Route 11 in Harlan County. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean. The kind that punishes. Cold October sheets that turned the countryside into a blur of gray and black, that hammered the tin roof of the diner so hard conversation inside required near shouting, that pooled in the potholes where 12 Harleys now sat steaming like wounded animals, their engines ticking as they cooled. The Iron Saints Motorcycle Club didn't look like men who had just completed a 200-mile charity ride for a children's hospital 3 counties over. They looked like men the world had tried to destroy and failed. Mud-streaked leather, soaked bandanas, faces carved by wind and road and years of choosing the harder path. They filed through the front door of Mabel's in a single column, boots heavy on warped hardwood, the smell of wet leather and exhaust trailing them like a second shadow. The diner went quiet the way diners always went quiet when they walked in. Forks paused. Conversations dropped to whispers. A mother at a corner booth pulled her son closer without thinking. The waitress behind the counter, a woman named Doris who had been pouring coffee at Mabel's for 19 years, didn't flinch. She'd seen the Saints before. She knew the difference between dangerous and threatening, even if most people never learned. Ryder Kane came in last. He always came in last. Not because he was the president of the Iron Saints, he was, but because somewhere in the wreckage of 2 combat tours and a decade of riding with men who trusted him with their lives, he had developed the habit of checking every room before he entered it and checking every exit before he sat down. 46 years old. 6'2". A jaw that looked like it had been set and broken and set again. Gray threading through dark hair that he kept pulled back under a soaked bandana. His eyes were the color of dishwater, and they never stopped moving. He slid into the last booth by the window. The vinyl seat was cracked and cold. Rain streaked the glass beside him. Outside, the road was empty. Inside, his brothers filled 3 booths and a stretch of counter stools, their voices rising slowly as warmth and coffee and the smell of bacon grease began to thaw the silence out of them. Ryder didn't order. He never ordered right away. He sat with his hands flat on the table, watching the room settle, reading the diner the way he once read terrain in Fallujah. Exits, sight lines, faces, the family in the corner. The trucker at the counter hunched over a plate of eggs like he was guarding it. The cook visible through the pass-through window, a heavy-set man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, even though the sign on the wall said, "No smoking." "You gonna eat, or you gonna meditate?" Colt Walker dropped into the seat across from him. Vice President, 39. A former Army medic who had come home from Afghanistan with a titanium plate in his skull and a laugh that came too loud and lasted too long. The kind of laugh that covered something no one was allowed to mention. He pushed a laminated menu across the table. Ryder took it without looking at it. "Coffee? Black? You had coffee an hour ago." "Then I'll have it again." Colt shook his head but didn't push. He knew the rhythm. Ryder ate when the room felt right. The room didn't feel right yet, though Colt couldn't have said why. He waved Doris over instead and ordered enough for both of them. 2 burgers, extra fries, coleslaw, pie if they had it. The diner began to breathe again. The mother in the corner relaxed her grip on her son. The trucker went back to his eggs. Conversations resumed at normal volume. Someone fed quarters into the jukebox and an old country song crackled to life. Something about highways and heartbreak and leaving someone behind. Ryder's food arrived. He ate mechanically, the way soldiers eat. Fast, efficient, no pleasure in it, just fuel. His eyes never left the room. Colt talked about the charity ride, about the check they delivered to the hospital, about the little boy in the cancer ward who had asked to sit on a motorcycle, and how Brick, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a 260-pound man with a beard like a biblical plague, had lifted the boy onto his Harley and held him there for 20 minutes while the kid pretended to ride through imaginary mountains. Colt told the story like it was funny. His voice cracked once near the end. He covered it with a sip of coffee. Ryder pushed his plate aside, half the burger untouched. The fries were cold. The coleslaw sat in its little paper cup like a forgotten afterthought. He was reaching for his coffee when he felt it. Not heard. Felt. A presence beside the booth, small, quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't natural in a child. The kind of quiet that has been beaten into shape. He turned his head. She was standing less than 2 feet away. 8 years old, maybe. Probably less, given how thin she was. A gray hoodie 3 sizes too large hung off her frame like a collapsed tent. The sleeves were pulled past her wrists, bunched in her fists. Her hair was dark, tangled, unwashed, pulled back with a rubber band that was starting to break. Her face was pale, not the pale of winter, but the pale of someone who hadn't been outside in weeks. Her eyes were brown and enormous and locked on his plate with an intensity that made Ryder's chest tighten. She didn't look at him. She looked at the food. "Sir," she said. Her voice was barely audible above the jukebox in the rain. "Sir, may I eat what's left on your plate?" The words didn't register at first. Ryder heard them, but something in his brain refused to process them, the way the mind refuses to accept the sound of a tripwire clicking underfoot. He stared at her. She still wouldn't look at him. Her hands were shaking inside those oversized sleeves. Colt had gone silent across the table. His coffee cup was frozen halfway to his mouth. "What's your name?" Ryder's voice came out rougher than he intended. She flinched. A full-body flinch, the kind that starts in the shoulders and travels down through the spine and into the knees. The kind that doesn't come from being startled. The kind that comes from expecting to be hit. "Emma," she whispered. "My name is Emma." Ryder looked at Colt. Colt looked at Ryder. 19 years of brotherhood passed between them in that glance. No words needed. "Emma," Ryder said carefully, the way a man speaks to a cornered animal. "You don't need my leftovers. Let me get you a plate. Your own plate. Whatever you want." Her eyes widened, not with excitement, with terror. "I can't," she said quickly. "He'll know. He counts. He counts everything." The room shifted. Not visibly, not audibly, but something changed in the molecules of the air inside Mabel's roadside diner. At the counter, Brick had turned on his stool. His massive hands were flat on the countertop. Beside him, a wiry biker named Stitch, the club's road captain, had set down his fork with deliberate care. In the next booth, 2 more saints had stopped talking. Then 2 more. One by one, like dominoes falling in silence, 12 men became aware that something was wrong at Ryder's table. "Who counts, Emma?" Ryder asked. She shook her head, fast, mechanical, rehearsed. "Nobody. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. I'm sorry. I'll go." She turned to leave. "Wait." Ryder didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for her. He simply said the word, and something in his tone, the same tone that had once talked a 19-year-old Marine out of eating his own sidearm in a bombed-out building in Ramadi, made her stop. She stopped, but she didn't turn around. "Doris," Ryder called across the diner, "can I get a grilled cheese and a glass of milk over here?" Doris looked at the girl. Something moved across the waitress's face, something old and sad and knowing. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen without a word. "Sit down, Emma," Ryder said. "Just for a minute, just until the food comes." She hesitated for so long that Ryder thought she might run. Then, slowly, like someone lowering themselves into ice water, she slid into the booth beside Colt. She sat on the very edge of the seat. Her feet didn't touch the floor. Her hands stayed hidden in those sleeves. Colt didn't move, didn't speak. He knew that look. He'd treated children in Afghan villages who carried that exact same posture, that same architecture of fear built into the body, like rebar in concrete. You didn't touch them. You didn't crowd them. You sat still and you waited and you let them decide whether you were safe. The grilled cheese arrived. Emma stared at it for a full 10 seconds before reaching for it. When she did, her right sleeve slid back, and Ryder saw the first bruise. Purple-green, the size of a man's thumb, pressed into the inside of her wrist. His eyes flicked to Colt. Colt had seen it too. His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Emma ate the way Ryder ate, fast. No savoring, just consumption. She drank the milk in 3 long swallows and set the glass down carefully, precisely, as if placing it wrong might trigger an alarm. "Thank you," she said, still not looking at either of them. "That was very good. I should go now." "Emma." Ryder leaned forward slightly. "Where are your parents?" Something broke behind her eyes, a hairline fracture in the mask she wore. It lasted half a second before she rebuilt it. "They're gone. I live with my uncle." "Is your uncle here?" "He's in the car. He's waiting. He doesn't like waiting." "What's his name?" She shook her head again, that mechanical head shake, side to side, side to side. A programmed response. "I'm not supposed to talk to people. I'm sorry, I need to go." She slid out of the booth. As she did, she reached up to adjust her hoodie, pulling it tighter around her neck, and the fabric shifted. What Ryder saw made his blood turn to concrete in his veins, her upper back, visible for maybe 3 seconds through the gaping collar of that oversized hoodie. Pale skin marked with dark bruises in various stages of healing, yellow and purple and blue, layered like geological strata. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the writing, black marker, numbers, tally marks, dates, written directly on her skin in a cramped, methodical hand, organized in columns. Some numbers had been crossed out. Others were circled. It looked like an accountant's ledger, except the ledger was an 8-year-old girl's body. Ryder had seen a lot of things in his life. He had seen combat. He had seen death. He had seen men torn apart by explosives and left in pieces on roads that didn't have names. He had seen things that visited him at 3 in the morning and refused to leave until dawn, but he had never seen anything like this. He stood up. Not fast. Not slow. The way a man stands when every part of him wants to break something and every part of him knows he can't. Behind him, without a word, without a signal, without a sound, 11 other men stood up. Colt was on his feet first. Then Brick at the counter, his stool scraping back against the floor. Then Stitch. Then the others. One by one by one. 12 men in wet leather standing in a roadside diner while a country song played on a broken jukebox and rain hammered the tin roof, and a little girl walked toward the front door with the posture of someone marching toward a firing squad. The door opened before she reached it. He came in like weather, cold and sudden and wrong. A man in his late 40s, tall, lean, wearing a charcoal overcoat over a pressed shirt and slacks. Everything about him was expensive and controlled. His shoes, his watch, his haircut, his anger, which sat behind his eyes like something pacing in a cage. Calvin Reeves. He didn't look at the bikers. He looked at Emma. And what Ryder saw in that look was not concern. It was ownership. "Emma." His voice was quiet, precise. The kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. "What did I tell you about talking to strangers?" Emma's entire body changed. Whatever tiny looseness the grilled cheese and the warm booth had given her evaporated. She contracted, shoulders in, chin down, hands clasped. She became a smaller version of herself right there in front of 12 witnesses. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're always sorry." Calvin took her arm, not roughly, not gently, with the grip of someone handling an object. "Let's go." "Hold on." Ryder stepped forward, 1 step, that was all. But the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Calvin looked at him for the first time. His eyes moved from Ryder's face to his vest to the Iron Saints patch to the road grime on his boots and back up again. His expression didn't change. It was the expression of a man who had already decided what everyone in the room was worth. "Can I help you?" Calvin's tone was polished, professional, the tone of a man who had lawyers on speed dial and knew it. "The girl's hungry," Ryder said. "When's the last time she ate?" "I appreciate your concern. Emma has a tendency to seek attention. She's accident-prone and imaginative. We're working with a therapist." He smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. She's my niece. I have legal custody. We're fine. I didn't ask about custody. I asked when she last ate. The smile didn't waver. As I said, we're fine. Thank you for the concern. Let's not make this into something it isn't. He pulled Emma toward the door. She went without resistance, without looking back. Ryder watched them through the rain-streaked window. A black sedan, late model, clean. Calvin opened the rear door and Emma climbed in. He didn't buckle her seatbelt. He didn't check on her. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and pulled out of the lot. The headlights cut through the rain and disappeared up Route 11. The diner was silent. Even the jukebox had stopped. Ryder. Colt's voice came from directly behind him, low, steady. The medic's voice. The one that meant something needed attention right now. Tell me you saw what I saw. I saw it. Those markings on her back. That wasn't random. That was organized. Somebody is keeping score on that kid. Ryder didn't respond immediately. He was memorizing the license plate. He had it. Every digit, every letter, burned into his brain the way coordinates used to burn in. Doris. He turned to the counter. That man. You know him? Doris was wiping down the counter with hands that weren't entirely steady. Calvin Reeves, he moved into the old Harrington property about 2 years ago, after the Harts died. The Harts? Emma's parents. Michael and Sarah Hart. Good people. Local. They died in a car accident coming back from the city. Black ice on the overpass. Emma was with a sitter. Doris paused, set down her rag, looked at Ryder with an expression that was half shame and half surrender. People talk, people in town. They say things aren't right out at that property. They say the girl never goes to school. Never see her in town anymore. Used to be a bright little thing. Used to come in here with her mama every Saturday for pancakes. And nobody's done anything? The silence that followed was its own answer. Doris picked up her rag again. Calvin Reeves donates to everything. The sheriff's fundraiser, the volunteer fire department, the Little League. He's got lawyers from the city. People tried calling CPS once, maybe twice. Nothing ever came of it. Investigations opened and closed. That's how it works out here when someone has money and everyone else has mortgages. Ryder looked at Colt. Colt looked at Brick. Brick looked at Stitch. The chain of glances moved through all 12 men like a current through a wire. Somebody pull that plate number, Ryder said quietly, and somebody find out everything there is to know about Calvin Reeves. Stitch already had his phone out. On it. Brick hadn't moved from his stool. His hands were still flat on the counter. The only thing that had changed was his breathing, which had become slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man containing something volcanic. That girl looked at us like she expected to be kicked, he said. His voice was surprisingly soft for a man his size. She looked at food like she didn't believe it was real. Ryder dropped a $50 bill on the table. Then he turned to the rest of the club. 11 faces stared back at him. Wet, tired, muddy, and absolutely, unshakably certain about what came next. Nobody goes home tonight, he said. We find out where that sedan went. We find out what's happening to that girl. And we find out why nobody in this entire county has done a thing about it. He walked toward the door, stopped, turned back to Doris. Those calls to CPS, you know who made them? Doris nodded slowly. Linda Chen. She teaches over at the elementary school. Used to, anyway. She retired after the second investigation went nowhere. Said she couldn't stomach it anymore. Lives on Maple, past the feed store. Ryder memorized the name, the street, the detail about the feed store. Then he pushed through the door into the storm, and 11 men followed him without being asked, the way water follows gravity, the way shadows follow light. The rain hit his face like needles. His bike was cold under him when he swung a leg over the seat. The engine turned once, twice, then caught with a sound like a sleeping animal waking up angry. Behind him, 11 more engines roared to life in sequence, one after another, filling the parking lot with a wall of sound that rolled across the empty countryside like thunder that didn't come from the sky. They pulled out of Mabel's in formation, 2 abreast, headlights cutting the rain into silver slashes. They didn't know where they were going yet. They didn't have a plan. What they had was a license plate, a name, a retired schoolteacher's address, and the image of an 8-year-old girl with the ledger of punishment written on her back in black marker. Ryder rode at the front with the rain in his eyes and the memory of Emma's voice in his ears. That whisper. That terrible, practiced, carefully modulated whisper designed to take up as little space as possible. Designed by someone who had learned, through repetition and pain, that being noticed meant being hurt. He had heard that whisper before, not from a child, from himself. In a hospital bed in Germany, 20 years ago, when a nurse had asked him his name and he had whispered it because shouting meant the shelling would start again. Some sounds you never forget, and some sounds you spend the rest of your life trying to silence. The bikes turned east on Route 11. The rain intensified. The road ahead was black and unmarked and endless. Somewhere out there, in a house with bolted windows and security cameras, an 8-year-old girl was being punished for eating a grilled cheese sandwich. And 12 men who had survived wars, buried brothers, and carried scars in places no one would ever see were riding straight into the storm to find her. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man on a motorcycle. It's a man in a pressed shirt with a charcoal overcoat and legal custody of a child who has learned that hunger is safer than asking for help. Ryder's phone buzzed in his jacket, a text from Stitch. He pulled it at a red light, rain blurring the screen. 4 words. Plate comes back wrong. He stared at the message. Read it again, then again. The plate on Calvin Reeves' sedan didn't match any registered vehicle. The light turned green. Ryder pocketed the phone and twisted the throttle and rode into the dark. And the question that now burned hotter than the engine beneath him was the one no one had asked yet. If Calvin Reeves wasn't who he claimed to be, then who had legal custody of Emma Hart? And if no one did, then what exactly had been happening to that girl for the last 2 years? The storm swallowed the road ahead. 12 headlights cut through it like prayers that had nowhere to land. And somewhere in the dark, a child who hadn't been a child in a very long time pressed her face against a cold window and watched the rain and tried to remember what her mother's voice sounded like. She couldn't. She could only remember his. The retired schoolteacher's house on Maple Street sat behind a row of dead hydrangeas, its porch light flickering like a weak pulse. Linda Chen opened the door at 11:40 at night to find Ryder Kane standing on her steps with rain streaming off his leather vest and 11 motorcycles rumbling in her driveway. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She looked at his face, then past him at the bikes, then back at his face, and said, "You're here about the girl." It wasn't a question. She let them in. Not all 12. The house couldn't hold that. Ryder, Colt, and Stitch came inside. The rest waited in the rain without complaint, smoking under the eave of her garage, their cigarettes glowing like small orange planets in the dark. Linda Chen was 63 years old. She had taught second grade for 31 years at Harlan County Elementary. She had a cat named Professor who hid under the couch when the bikers walked in. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck and hands that trembled slightly when she poured coffee, though whether from age or from what she was about to say, Ryder couldn't tell. "Sit down," she said, gesturing at a kitchen table covered in crossword puzzle books. "And don't drip on my floor more than you have to." Ryder sat. Colt leaned against the counter. Stitch stood by the door because Stitch always stood by the door. "The plate on his car comes back wrong," Ryder said without preamble. "Tell me about Calvin Reeves." Linda set 3 mugs of coffee on the table. She didn't sit down. She stood with her arms crossed, staring at the window above the sink like she could see something in the dark glass that the rest of them couldn't. Calvin Reeves showed up 2 months after the Harts died. He had paperwork, legal custody documents, said he was Michael's half-brother from a second marriage nobody in town knew about. The court signed off. CPS did a home visit. Everything checked out on paper. She paused, uncrossed her arms, crossed them again. "Paper doesn't scream at night." Colt set his coffee down. "You heard her screaming." "No, but I saw her the last time she came to school, 7 months after Calvin arrived. She used to be the kind of child who drew flowers on everything, on her folders, on her desk, on the back of her hand during math. She drew them everywhere." Linda's voice cracked. She waited. Let the crack seal itself. Continued. "The last day I saw her, she drew a picture of a house with no doors, just walls, windows with bars, a stick figure inside. I asked her about it. She tore it up. She tore it into pieces so small you couldn't put them back together, and she ate them." The kitchen went still. Even the rain seemed to pause. She ate the paper, Linda repeated. An 8-year-old child ate her own drawing rather than let anyone see what she'd told the truth about. Ryder's hands were flat on the table. His knuckles had gone white. You filed reports. 2. The first time, CPS sent an investigator, young woman, fresh out of school. She went to the property, did a walkthrough, talked to Calvin. He gave her a tour, showed her Emma's room, clean bed, toys, bookshelf full of books. He was charming, articulate, concerned. Linda's mouth twisted around the last word like it tasted wrong. The investigator closed the case in 3 days, unsubstantiated. And the second time? The second time I went to the sheriff directly, showed him photographs I'd taken of Emma's arms during recess. Bruises, she said, came from falling off a bike. She doesn't own a bike. Linda walked to the window and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Sheriff Pruitt listened very carefully, took notes, said he'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I was called into the superintendent's office and told my classroom complaints were creating a hostile environment for a grieving family. Calvin Reeves had retained a lawyer from Richmond. I was offered early retirement with full benefits. I took it. You took it, Ryder said. Not an accusation, not quite. Linda turned from the window. Her eyes were red but dry. I took it because I am 63 years old and I live alone, and the man who is hurting that child has more money than everyone on this street combined, and the system I spent my life believing in told me to sit down and be quiet. Her voice shook. So yes, I sat down, and I have been quiet. And every single night for the past 14 months, I have gone to bed knowing that I failed her. Nobody spoke. The cat emerged from under the couch, looked at the room full of damaged men and one broken woman, and retreated again. Stitch cleared his throat from the doorway. Mrs. Chen, the property, what do you know about it? The Harrington place, 60 acres outside town, old farmstead. Calvin renovated it when he moved in. Put up fences, security cameras, hired a crew from out of town to do the work. Nobody local. She looked at Stitch. You can't see the house from the road anymore. He planted a tree line. Douglas firs, thick enough that you can't see past them from any angle. He's hiding something, Colt said. He's hiding someone, Linda corrected. He's hiding Emma. Ryder stood, his chair scraped against the linoleum floor. Mrs. Chen, the trust fund, the Hart's estate, what do you know about it? The question changed the air in the room. Linda looked at him sharply, then slowly, deliberately sat down in the chair across from him. How do you know about the trust? I don't. That's why I'm asking. Linda removed her glasses, cleaned them on her sweater, put them back on. Every gesture careful, measured, the habits of a woman who had spent 3 decades teaching children to take their time before answering. Michael Hart's family owned mineral rights in this county, going back 4 generations. When the natural gas boom hit 10 years ago, those rights became worth a great deal of money. Michael was careful. He put everything into a trust for Emma. The trust matures when she turns 18. Until then, a guardian controls the distributions. She paused. I don't know the exact number, but people in town talk. They say it's somewhere north of $4 million. The figure landed in the room like a grenade. Colt pushed off the counter. So the custody isn't about the kid. It's about the money. I can't prove that, Linda said. I can't prove anything. That's the entire problem. Ryder looked at Stitch. The plates. Stitch pulled out his phone, scrolled through messages. I ran it through a contact at the DMV. The plate on Calvin's sedan is registered to a 2019 Buick LeSabre in West Virginia. The vehicle was reported totaled in a flood 18 months ago. Insurance paid out. The plates should have been destroyed. The implications stacked on top of each other like bricks building a wall. Fake plates. A custody claim nobody could verify. A child hidden behind tree lines and security cameras. A trust fund worth millions controlled by a man who might not be who he said he was. Ryder zipped his jacket. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. We'll be in touch. What are you going to do? She asked. Not skeptical, not hopeful, just tired. Ryder stopped at the door. Something you shouldn't have had to do alone. They rode back through the storm. The rain had shifted from sheets to needles, driven sideways by a wind that cut through leather like it wasn't there. At the clubhouse, a converted machine shop on a dead-end road east of town, the 12 members of the Iron Saints gathered around a scarred table that had seen more arguments than most courthouses. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed and flickered. Someone had left a pot of coffee on the burner so long it had turned to tar. Brick dumped it and made a fresh pot without being asked. Stitch pinned a county map to the corkboard on the wall and circled the Harrington property in red marker. Colt laid out his phone with the text messages and DMV records arranged in chronological order. Ryder stood at the head of the table and said nothing for a long time. It was Judge who broke the silence. His real name was Marcus Adler. He was the club's treasurer, 51 years old, a former public defender who had lost his license after a breakdown following a case he never talked about. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had a habit of tapping his index finger on whatever surface was in front of him when he was thinking. He was tapping now. "We need to be careful," Judge said. "What we have right now is a fake license plate and a retired schoolteacher's testimony. That's not enough for a warrant. That's not enough for anything." "It's enough for us," Brick said from the coffee maker. "It's enough to get us arrested," Judge countered, "and then we're no good to anyone, least of all that girl." The table shifted. Tensions that live beneath the surface of every brotherhood began to show. Ryder could feel them the way a sailor feels a current change, not in the waves, in the weight of the water underneath. A biker named Deacon, late 30s, tattooed knuckles, a former foster kid himself who had bounced through 11 homes before aging out of the system at 18, leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "I'm not sitting in this room debating procedure while a kid has tally marks on her back. I'm not doing it. Somebody tell me the plan or I'll make my own." "That's exactly what we can't do," Judge said, his voice sharpening. "Easy for you to say. You had parents." The room went cold. Judge's tapping stopped. He removed his glasses, set them on the table, and stared at Deacon with an expression that contained more pain than anger. "I had parents," Judge said quietly. "And I had a client, a 12-year-old boy whose foster father beat him with a garden hose every Tuesday because Tuesday was the day he drank. I built a case. I followed procedure. I filed motions. I did everything right. And the judge ruled insufficient evidence because the foster father wore a tie to court and spoke in complete sentences, and the boy was black, and the judge was tired." He put his glasses back on. "The boy hanged himself 3 months later, in the closet of the room where the beatings happened, with the garden hose. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. So don't tell me I don't understand urgency," Judge continued. "I understand it better than you ever will. And I'm telling you that if we go in wrong, if we give Calvin Reeves any legal foothold, any procedural error to exploit, he will bury this so deep that no one will ever find that child again. We get one shot. One. And it has to be clean." Deacon sat back. His hands were shaking, not from anger, from recognition, from the specific jagged shape of a wound he shared with the man he had just attacked. Ryder let the silence hold. He let it do the work that words couldn't. Then he spoke. "Judge is right. We go legal first. Stitch, I need everything you can pull on Calvin Reeves. Birth records, court filings, employment history, financial disclosures. If this man claimed to be Michael Hart's half-brother, there should be a paper trail. Find it or prove it doesn't exist." Stitch nodded. "Colt, you were a medic. You know what those marks on her back mean in clinical terms. I need you to document what we saw. Descriptions, locations, patterns. Write it like a medical report." Colt's expression tightened. "I'll need more than a 3-second glimpse through a hoodie collar." "You'll get it." "How?" Ryder didn't answer that question. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Brick. "The property. I need eyes on it. Not trespassing. Not approaching. Just watching. Sight lines, camera positions, entry points, exit points. How many people go in and out? When? How often?" Brick's jaw worked beneath his beard. "I can have a rotation set up by morning. Do it." "And the sheriff?" Judge asked. "Prewitt. He shut down the teacher. He'll shut us down too." "That's why we don't go to the sheriff," Ryder said. "Not yet. Not until we have something he can't ignore, something his lawyers can't bury, something that goes over his head." The meeting broke at 2 a.m. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world slick and black and silent. Most of the men drifted to cots and couches scattered around the clubhouse, the kind of restless half-sleep that combat veterans know intimately, the body resting while the mind stands guard. Ryder didn't sleep. He sat outside on an overturned milk crate with a cigarette he didn't light, holding it between his fingers out of habit, the way a man holds a weapon he's decided not to fire. The air smelled like wet earth and diesel fuel and the ghost of rain. Colt found him there 20 minutes later. The medic lowered himself onto a second crate with a groan. His bad knee, the one that had caught shrapnel outside Kandahar, always locked up in cold weather. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that only exists between two people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. "You're going back to the diner," Colt said. Not a question. "Tomorrow." Doris said Emma used to come in with her mother on Saturdays. If Calvin follows any kind of routine, if he takes her anywhere at all, the diner's the only place in town where someone might have seen a pattern. And if there's no pattern, if he keeps her locked in that house. Ryder looked at the unlit cigarette in his hand, rolled it between his fingers. "Then we make a pattern." "Meaning what?" "Meaning we find a reason to be on that road. Every day. We find a reason to be visible. We let him know that someone is watching. Someone who isn't the sheriff. Someone who isn't CPS. Someone who doesn't take donations and look the other way." Colt was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You know this is going to cost us. Everything costs us. I mean specifically. The club's on probation from the incident in Carver County. Judge is right about that. We can't afford another confrontation with law enforcement. If Prewitt decides we're harassing a citizen, he can pull our charter. Impound the bikes. There are guys in this club who have custody arrangements, Ryder. Deacon has a hearing next month for visitation with his daughter. You start a war with a connected man in a small town and everyone who rides with us pays the price." The words landed where they were supposed to land, in the soft tissue, in the place where leadership and guilt share a border. "I know," Ryder said. "So what's the play?" "The play is we don't start a war. We build a case, quietly, legally. Brick watches the property, Stitch pulls records, Judge finds us a contact at the state level, someone above the county line who can't be bought with a check to the Little League. And I go back to that diner tomorrow and I sit in that booth and I wait." "For what?" "For her to come back, because she will. That girl hasn't had a full meal in weeks. She found food once. She'll find it again. And when she does, I need to be there. Because next time I'm not letting her walk out the door." Colt stared at him. In the dim light leaking from the clubhouse window, the scar on the medic's temple looked like a crack in glass. "You know what this is, right? You know what's happening to you right now?" Ryder didn't answer. "It's Ramadi. It's the kid in the building, the one you couldn't get to in time." The silence that followed was so heavy it had a physical weight. Ryder's hand closed around the cigarette, crushing it. Tobacco spilled between his fingers like dry sand. "Don't," he said. One word, flat, final. A door slamming shut. "I'm your medic, on the road and off it. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. And I'm telling you that this has nothing to do with Ramadi. A child you couldn't save then. A child you might be able to save now. You don't see the connection?" Ryder stood up. The milk crate toppled behind him. "I see a little girl with a punishment chart on her back and a town full of people who decided she wasn't their problem. That's what I see. And if you want to psychoanalyze me, Colt, do it on your own time, not on hers." He walked inside. The door banged shut behind him. Colt stayed on the crate, alone in the cold, listening to the last of the storm drain off the roof in irregular drops. He rubbed his knee. He thought about the boy in Ramadi that Ryder had never talked about except once, drunk, at 3 a.m. in a motel outside Tulsa, when the words had come out of him like shrapnel working its way to the surface years after the blast. A boy trapped in a collapsed building. Ryder could hear him calling, couldn't reach him. Dug with his hands until his fingers bled. The building shifted. Command ordered him back. He went back. The calling stopped 12 minutes later. Colt had never brought it up again. Until tonight. Because tonight he watched Ryder look at Emma Hart, and what he saw in the man's eyes wasn't just compassion. It was debt. And men who carry debts they can never repay will walk into fire to settle the account, and they won't care who burns beside them. Morning came gray and reluctant. Fog sat in the valleys like smoke after a battle. Stitch was already at his laptop when the rest of the club stirred, his face lit by the blue glow of the screen, an energy drink and 3 empty chip bags beside him. He hadn't slept. "Ryder," he said the name the moment the president appeared in the doorway. "You need to see this." The others gathered behind him. 12 men staring at a laptop screen in a converted machine shop, the smell of stale coffee and wet leather hanging in the air like a permanent condition. "Calvin Reeves doesn't exist," Stitch said. "Or rather, he does, but only starting 3 years ago. Before that, nothing. No birth certificate I can find, no school records, no employment history, no tax returns. The Social Security number attached to his name was issued in Delaware 18 months before the Harts died. It was a new issuance, not a replacement. New." The room processed this in silence. The custody documents filed with the county court reference Calvin Reeves as the half-brother of Michael Hart through Michael's father, Robert Hart, and a woman named Patricia Reeves in Wheeling, West Virginia. Stitch scrolled down. "I pulled Robert Hart's records. He died in 1998. His only marriage was to Catherine Hart, Michael's mother. There was no Patricia Reeves, there was no second marriage, there was no half-brother." Judge removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on. His index finger was tapping the table so fast it sounded like a woodpecker. "The custody filing," Judge said. "Who signed off on it?" "Family court judge named Ballard. Retired 6 months after the ruling, moved to Florida." "And the lawyer who filed?" "A firm in Richmond, Hollister and Webb. I looked them up. The firm dissolved last year. The lead attorney, a man named Grant Hollister, is currently under investigation by the state bar for—" Stitch paused, looked at Ryder. "For fabricating legal documents in 3 separate custody cases." The silence in the room was the kind that comes before avalanches. Deacon broke it. His voice was barely controlled. "So a man with a fake identity and forged custody papers has been keeping a dead couple's daughter locked in a farmhouse for 2 years, with a multi-million-dollar trust fund sitting underneath all of it." "That's what it looks like," Stitch said. "That's not what it looks like," Ryder said quietly, and every head in the room turned to him. "That's what it is. And now the question isn't whether we act. The question is how fast we can move before he figures out someone's pulling his threads." Brick's phone buzzed. The big man looked at the screen. His face changed. "First rotation just checked in from the property," he said. "The sedan's gone. Gates open. Cameras are still running, but the driveway's empty." He looked up. "Calvin Reeves isn't home." "Where's the girl?" Ryder asked. "Can't tell. No visual on the house from the tree line." The room went electric. 12 men and one question and no answer, and the fog outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. Ryder grabbed his jacket. "Colt, Brick, with me. Everyone else stays here. Stitch, keep digging. Judge, find me a contact at the State Attorney General's office. Someone who handles child welfare fraud." "Ryder," Judge's voice carried a warning. "If you go to that property and he's not there and you cross the property line, anything we've built becomes inadmissible. Everything." "I'm not crossing any line. You're crossing one right now. You just don't know which one yet." Ryder met Judge's eyes. 2 men who understood the law. One who had been destroyed by it. One who was about to test every boundary it had. "If that girl is in that house alone," Ryder said, "then she's in that house alone because the man who forged his way into her life left her there. And I am going to drive past that property on a public road, and I am going to look at it from a legal distance, and I am going to see what there is to see. That's all." He walked out the door. Colt followed. Brick followed. 3 motorcycles fired up in the gray morning fog, their exhaust mixing with the mist until you couldn't tell where the machines ended and the weather began. They took Route 11 east. The road wound through low hills and dead farmland, past abandoned barns and rusted fences, and mailboxes with names on them that nobody answered to anymore. The Harrington property was 6 miles outside town. You could miss it if you weren't looking. That was the point. Stitch had been right about the tree line. Douglas firs planted close enough together that their branches interlocked into a solid green wall. Behind them, nothing visible. Not the house, not the driveway, not the sky above the roof, just green, dense, impenetrable. The kind of privacy that isn't about solitude. The kind that's about concealment. Ryder slowed his bike at the gate. Chain link, 8 feet tall, topped with razor wire that glinted even in the flat gray light. A security camera mounted on a post swiveled toward him as he stopped. Red light blinking, recording. He looked at the camera. Let it see his face. Let it see his vest. Let it see the Iron Saints patch. Then he looked past the gate, down the gravel driveway that disappeared into the trees, and he saw something that made every muscle in his body go rigid. A small handprint, pressed into the mud just inside the gate. Fresh. The rain from last night would have washed away anything older. This was from this morning. A child's hand, fingers spread, pressed flat into the wet earth beside the driveway, as if she had been kneeling there. Or crawling. Beside the handprint, partially obscured by gravel, was a piece of paper, torn, small, folded once, caught against the base of the fence post by the wind. Ryder looked at the camera again. Looked at the gate. Looked at the paper. He did not cross the property line. He didn't have to. The wind shifted and the paper tumbled through the chain-link fence onto the public road, landing at his boot like a message delivered by the storm itself. He picked it up. Unfolded it. A child's drawing. Crayon on lined paper, the kind torn from a school composition book. A house with no doors, walls but no doors. Windows with bars drawn in heavy black lines. A stick figure inside. And outside the house, standing in a row, 12 circles, each one colored brown, each one with 2 wheels beneath it. Motorcycles. She had drawn them from memory. 12 motorcycles lined up outside a prison with no exit. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting so small he had to squint to read it, 4 words that split his chest open like a round through Kevlar. Please come back for me. Ryder folded the paper, put it in his jacket, looked at Colt, looked at Brick. No one spoke. No one needed to. The point of no return doesn't announce itself with sirens or alarms. It arrives quietly, on a torn piece of paper carried by the wind, written in crayon by a child who drew motorcycles because they were the first thing in 2 years that looked like rescue. There was no going back now. For any of them. Ryder didn't show the drawing to the rest of the club right away. He carried it inside his jacket for 47 minutes while 3 motorcycles rode back through fog so thick the road ahead dissolved into nothing 2 bike lengths out. He carried it against his chest, where the paper absorbed his body heat, and the crayon lines pressed against his shirt like a bruise forming in reverse. He carried it because he needed those 47 minutes to decide what kind of man he was going to be when he walked through the clubhouse door. The man who followed the law, or the man who followed the drawing. He chose neither. He chose a third option that didn't exist until he created it on that ride back, somewhere between mile marker 9 and the dead traffic light at the edge of town that hadn't worked in 3 years. He chose to become the man who would dismantle Calvin Reeves piece by piece, legally, systematically, and without mercy, even if it meant dragging his own past into the light to do it. He walked into the clubhouse and put the drawing on the table. Nobody spoke for a long time. 12 men stared at 12 crayon motorcycles drawn by a child who had remembered them from a single encounter in a roadside diner. Deacon was the first to look away. He turned his back to the table and pressed his forehead against the wall and stayed there, breathing, his tattooed hands flat against the cinder block like he was holding the building up. Stitch, Ryder said. What else? Stitch hadn't stopped digging. The laptop screen was now surrounded by a graveyard of energy drink cans and a legal pad filled with notes in handwriting so cramped it looked like code. He pulled the laptop forward and turned it so the screen faced the table. Calvin Reeves is a ghost. Built from scratch. The social security number, the custody documents, the address history, all fabricated within a 20-month window. But ghosts leave footprints if you know where to look. He tapped the screen. I ran his face through a reverse image search using the photo from his driver's license. Got nothing on the first pass. On the second pass, I widened the parameters and picked up a match from a newspaper archive in Huntington, West Virginia. 7 years old. The screen showed a grainy photograph from a local newspaper. A man in a suit standing behind a podium at what appeared to be a civic fundraiser. The caption beneath it read, Warren Selby, director of Ridgeline Asset Management, addresses the Cabell County Chamber of Commerce. The face was younger, the hair was different, but it was the same man. Calvin Reeves was Warren Selby. Ridgeline Asset Management, Stitch continued, registered in West Virginia in 2016, dissolved in 2019. During its 3 years of operation, Ridgeline managed investment portfolios for 6 clients. All 6 were estates held in trust for minor children. All 6 children were orphans. The room didn't move. The room had stopped being a room and had become a held breath. Of those 6 estates, 4 were fully liquidated before the children reached the age of majority. The funds were transferred through a series of shell accounts and disappeared. The 2 remaining estates, including Emma Hart's, are still active. Stitch looked up from the screen. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face had the hollow look of a man who had spent the night staring into an abyss and watching it stare back. Calvin Reeves doesn't just have Emma. He has a system. He finds orphaned children with money, fabricates custody, drains the trust, and vanishes before anyone notices. Judge's finger had stopped tapping. His hand was flat on the table, perfectly still, which was worse. "The other children," he said. "The 4 whose estates were liquidated, where are they now?" Stitch's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet. 2 were placed with new foster families after Selby disappeared from their cases. The other 2... He paused, swallowed. "I can't find them." The sentence hung in the air like smoke with nowhere to go. "Can't find them meaning what?" Brick said from his corner. His voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes structural failure. "Meaning they're not in any system I can access. No school records, no medical records, no foster placements, no death certificates. They just stop existing in the paperwork around the same time the money runs out." Deacon turned from the wall. His face was wet, and he didn't care who saw it. "How old?" "One was 6 when the trust was drained. The other was 9. Deacon walked out of the room. The door slammed behind him. Through the thin walls of the clubhouse, they could hear him retching in the parking lot. Nobody went after him. Some things need to come up before a man can function again. Ryder stood at the head of the table with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall, beyond the building, beyond the town, fixed on a place inside his own skull where decisions were made that could not be unmade. "Judge," he said, "State Attorney General, now." "I made the call this morning. I've got a contact. Woman named Helen Marsh, Assistant AG, Child Welfare Crimes Division. She's based in the capital. I gave her the broad strokes without names or locations. She's interested, but she needs documentation. Physical evidence, something that ties Calvin Reeves to Warren Selby beyond a newspaper photograph." "How long?" "She said she could open a preliminary investigation within 72 hours if we deliver a credible package. Financial records, identity discrepancies, testimony. 72 hours. Ryder said it like he was tasting something bitter. "That girl has been in that house for 2 years. Every day we wait is another day on her back." "I know that. But if we move without the AG's backing, we've got nothing. A motorcycle club accusing a private citizen of fraud and child abuse. How do you think that plays in front of a judge? How do you think Calvin's lawyers spin that?" Ryder knew how they'd spin it. He'd seen it before. The bikers as aggressors. The respectable citizen as victim. The narrative flipped so fast it would make their heads bleed. He knew it, and he hated knowing it because knowing it meant Judge was right, and Judge being right meant 3 more days of that child inside those walls. "Then we build the package," Ryder said. "Today, right now, everything Stitch has. Mrs. Chen's testimony, Colt's medical assessment from what we observed, the drawing." He looked at the crayon motorcycles on the table. "And we need something else. We need someone who can connect Warren Selby's financial crimes to Emma's trust specifically. Bank records, account transfers, something with his fingerprints on the money." "That's going to be hard to get without a subpoena," Judge said. "Then find a way to make it easy." The tension between Ryder and Judge was not new. It lived in the foundation of the club like rebar in concrete. Ryder led with instinct. Judge led with caution. Between them, the club held its shape. But today the rebar was bending, and both men could feel it. Stitch raised his hand slightly, the way he always did when he had something that was going to change the conversation. There might be another way. The lawyer. Grant Hollister. The one under investigation by the state bar. What about him? His disciplinary hearing is next month. He's facing disbarment. 3 counts of fabricating legal documents. If those documents include the custody filing for Emma Hart, and if someone were to present that connection to the bar's investigative panel alongside what we've found about Selby's identity fraud. Stitch let the implication finish itself. Judge straightened. Hollister would flip. A disbarred lawyer facing criminal charges would trade information for a deal. He would give up Selby, the custody fraud, the trust manipulation, all of it, if it meant reduced charges. Can you get to him? Ryder asked. I still have contacts from my years as a public defender. People who owe me favors I never cashed in. Judge paused. Something moved behind his eyes, the shadow of the career he'd lost and the life he'd built on its ruins. I can try. Don't try. Do it. Judge held Ryder's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, stood, and walked to the back room where the landline was. The door closed behind him. The morning aged into afternoon. The fog burned off, but the sky stayed gray. A low ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the town like a lid on a pot. Brick's surveillance rotation reported in every 2 hours. The sedan had not returned to the Harrington property. The gate remained open. The cameras were still running. No movement visible from the road. Where was Calvin Reeves? Where was Emma? The question ate at Ryder like acid. He paced the clubhouse. He drank coffee until his hands shook. He went outside and sat on the milk crate and held an unlit cigarette and stared at the road and thought about a building in Ramadi that he had walked away from because command told him to walk away. He had walked away. The calling had stopped. And for 20 years he had carried the silence that came after the calling stopped, carried it in his chest like a stone that grew heavier with every year, a stone that no amount of road or wind or distance could wear down. He wasn't going to walk away again. Not this time. Not from this. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Judge came out of the back room. His face was gray. His hands were shaking slightly. He walked to the table and sat down and took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on and then took them off again. Hollister talked, he said. Every man in the room stopped moving. Hollister fabricated the custody documents for Calvin Reeves. He knew Reeves was using a false identity. He was paid $75,000 for the filing, but here's the part that changes everything. Judge put his glasses on. His eyes behind the lenses were the eyes of a man who had just looked at something he wished he could unsee. Hollister didn't just fabricate custody for Emma Hart. He fabricated custody documents for all 6 children, every single one of Selby's targets. Hollister was the legal architect of the entire operation. The room absorbed this like concrete absorbs rain. Slowly. Then all at once. But that's not what's going to keep you up tonight, Judge continued. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Hollister told me that Selby has a timeline. Every custody case followed the same pattern. He establishes residency, gains custody, spends the first year consolidating control over the trust. The second year he begins systematic withdrawals. By the end of the second year, the trust is empty, and then he disappears. Emma's been in his custody for 2 years, Colt said from across the room. 23 months, Judge corrected. And according to Hollister, Selby has already begun the withdrawal phase. He's been pulling money from Emma's trust in increments. Hollister estimates the trust will be fully drained within the next 3 to 4 weeks. And then what? Brick said. He vanishes? Takes a new name? Finds another kid? Judge didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the drawing with the 12 crayon motorcycles. Hollister said something else. He said that in the cases where the children had no remaining family, no one to ask questions, Selby didn't just disappear. He made the children disappear too. Judge's voice cracked on the last word. He caught it, rebuilt it, kept going. He said he doesn't know how. He said he didn't want to know. He said he stopped asking after the second case because the answer would have made him an accessory to something he couldn't live with. The clubhouse went so quiet that Ryder could hear the electrical hum of the fluorescent light above the table. He could hear the slow drip of the coffee maker. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady, too steady, the heartbeat of a man whose body had learned to stay calm in the presence of horrors because staying calm was the only thing between him and the abyss. Emma Hart had no remaining family. Calvin Reeves, or Warren Selby, or whatever his name was, had been draining her trust for months. The timeline was almost up, and when the money ran out, the children disappeared. Ryder picked up the drawing from the table, looked at it one more time, the house with no doors, the stick figure inside, the 12 motorcycles standing outside like sentinels who hadn't yet been given permission to act. "Judge," he said, "call Helen Marsh, tell her everything Hollister said. Tell her we need those 72 hours compressed into 24. Tell her a child's life depends on it. She'll need Hollister on record. Then get him on record. He's afraid. He's facing disbarment and criminal charges. If Selby finds out he talked, Hollister is a liability. And Selby has shown what he does with liabilities. Then protect him. Promise him whatever you need to promise, but get him talking to the AG's office by tonight." Judge left the room again. This time, he didn't close the door. Ryder could hear him dialing, his voice low and urgent, the voice of a man who had once lost a boy to a system that failed and was now fighting to make sure the system worked just once, just this once, before it was too late. Brick's phone rang at 4:30. He answered it, listened for 9 seconds. His face drained of color so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. "The sedan's back," he said, "and there's a second vehicle, a van, white, no plates. 2 men are unloading boxes from the house into the van." The room went electric. "He's running," Colt said. "He's packing up." "Where's the girl?" Ryder demanded. Brick relayed the question into the phone, waited. The answer came back in fragments. "Can't confirm. No visual on Emma. The men are carrying boxes, file boxes, moving fast. One of them went back inside 2 minutes ago and hasn't come back out." Ryder looked at the clock on the wall, 4:32 in the afternoon. If Selby was packing up, if the timeline had accelerated, if something had tipped him off, then the 72 hours they didn't have had just become hours they might not have either. "What tipped him?" Stitch said, voicing the question everyone was thinking. "Why now? Why today?" The answer came to Ryder like a bullet he couldn't dodge. The camera. The security camera at the gate that morning. It had recorded him. His face, his vest, the Iron Saints patch. Selby had seen the footage. Selby had seen 3 bikers at his gate on the same day that someone was pulling his records and running his plates. He'd been careful. They'd all been careful. But the camera hadn't cared about careful. "He saw us," Ryder said, "this morning, at the gate. He reviewed the footage and he saw us." "You don't know that," Judge said from the doorway. "I know that a man who has spent 3 years hiding behind a fake name is now loading file boxes into a van with no plates 6 hours after 3 bikers parked outside his gate. That's not coincidence. That's a countdown." The room split. Not in half, not cleanly, but along fracture lines that had been forming since the first night. Deacon moved toward the door. Brick was already reaching for his jacket. Even Stitch closed the laptop and stood. Judge stepped into the center of the room. "We go to that property now, without law enforcement, without warrants, and we destroy every piece of legal ground we've built. Selby's lawyers will argue harassment, intimidation, trespassing. Every shred of evidence becomes fruit of the poisoned tree. He walks. He takes a new name. He finds another child. And Emma becomes one more kid who disappeared because someone couldn't wait 6 more hours." "6 hours might be 6 hours too late," Deacon said, his voice shaking. "Or 6 hours might be the difference between a conviction and a mistrial." The 2 positions hung in the air like opposing weights on a scale that couldn't balance. Judge and his procedure. Deacon and his fury. And between them, 11 other men who had to choose which weight to add themselves to. Ryder's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered it. "Mr. Kane." The voice was smooth, controlled, familiar. "My name is Calvin Reeves. I believe we met briefly last night at the diner." The room went absolutely still. Ryder hit the speaker button. The voice filled the clubhouse like cold water filling a sinking ship. "I noticed your visit to my property this morning. I appreciate your concern for my niece, but I want to assure you that Emma is well cared for and safe. She's a troubled child with a history of seeking attention from strangers, as I mentioned last night." Ryder said nothing. He let the silence work. "I'm calling because I want to avoid any misunderstandings. Small towns talk. Rumors circulate. I've spoken with Sheriff Pruitt. and he's aware of the situation. He's agreed to increase patrols near my property to ensure we're not disturbed again. A pause. Calculated. I'm also told that the Iron Saints have had some difficulties with law enforcement in Carver County. I'd hate to see those difficulties resurface over a simple misunderstanding. The threat was wrapped in silk, but it was still a blade. Mr. Kane, are you there? Ryder looked at the men around him. 12 faces. 12 different kinds of rage. He looked at the drawing on the table. He looked at the phone. I'm here, he said, and so are we. He hung up. The silence that followed was not the silence of indecision. It was the silence of a door closing. The last door. The one that locks behind you and doesn't have a handle on the other side. He knows, Colt said. He knows we're digging. And now he's got the sheriff on speed dial, Judge added. Prewitt will be at that property within the hour. If we show up, we're walking into a wall of badges and legal threats. He's boxing us out, Stitch said, using the system. The same system he's been hiding behind for 3 years. Ryder picked up the drawing one more time. Looked at the stick figure inside the house with no doors. A child drawn so small she was almost invisible against the walls that held her. And then he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Something so small it could have been a stray mark, an accident of crayon on paper. But it wasn't. In the corner of the drawing outside the house, separate from the 12 motorcycles, Emma had drawn a single figure. Not a stick figure like the one inside. This one had detail. Arms extended, legs mid-stride, running toward the motorcycles. She had drawn herself escaping. She had imagined it, committed it to paper, believed it was possible. And then she had folded the drawing and left it at the gate where the men with the motorcycles might find it. 8 years old, trapped in a house with no doors, and she had drawn her own rescue. Ryder set the drawing down and looked at Judge. Call Helen Marsh one more time, he said. Tell her we don't have 72 hours. We don't have 24. Tell her that by tomorrow morning, Calvin Reeves will be gone and so will Emma Hart. Tell her that if she wants to stop this, she needs to move tonight. And if she can't? Ryder looked at the door, the gray light beyond it, the road that led to a property surrounded by Douglas firs and security cameras, and a sheriff who had been bought with donations to the Little League. Then we move tonight anyway. Judge opened his mouth to argue, closed it, looked at the drawing on the table, looked at the stick figure running toward the motorcycles. He picked up the phone and dialed. 10 minutes later, he hung up. His face had changed. The caution was still there, but something else had joined it, something that looked like the ghost of the man he used to be before the boy with the garden hose had broken him. She's in, Judge said. Helen Marsh. She's been tracking orphan trust fraud cases across 3 states for 18 months. Selby's pattern matches an open investigation she couldn't close because she didn't have a live case. She has a live case now. She's contacting a federal judge for emergency warrants. She's dispatching state investigators tonight. But she needs us to do one thing. Name it. Stay away from the property until law enforcement arrives. No contact, no surveillance, nothing that gives Selby's defense team ammunition. The room erupted. Deacon slammed his palm on the table. Brick stood so fast his chair toppled backward. Even Colt, the medic, the steady one, the man who kept his voice level when everyone else's broke, raised his voice for the first time Ryder could remember. She wants us to sit here while that man packs a van and drives into the night with that kid? That's the plan? Ryder raised one hand. The room went quiet. Not because of authority, because of trust. 20 years of it. Built mile by mile, scar by scar. The AG moves tonight. State police, federal warrants. This isn't Sheriff Pruitt and a donated squad car. This is the kind of weight Calvin Reeves has never faced because he's always been gone before it arrived. He paused. Let the words settle. Our job tonight is not to rescue Emma. Our job tonight is to make sure Calvin Reeves doesn't leave that property before the warrants arrive. Without going to the property, Judge clarified. Without crossing the property line. But Route 11 is a public road, and a man has a right to ride a public road. Even at night, even in the rain, even 12 times in a row. Understanding moved through the room like current through water. Brick nodded slowly. Stitch's mouth twitched. Even Judge, who had argued against every instinct in the room for 24 hours, allowed himself something that was almost a smile. You want to blockade him without blockading him, Colt said. I want 12 motorcycles on Route 11 between his property and the highway from now until the warrants come through. Visible, audible, legal. If he tries to leave, he'll see us. If he tries to run, he'll have to go through us to reach any road that leads out of this county. And if he does try to go through us? Ryder looked at the window. The sky outside was darkening. Not from clouds, from time. The day was ending, night was coming, and somewhere in that night, a man who made children disappear was packing a van. Then he finds out what 12 men who have nothing left to lose look like when they're standing between a monster and a child. Deacon was the first to zip his jacket, then Brick, then Stitch. One by one, 12 men prepared to ride into a night that would either save a girl or destroy everything they had built. Ryder was the last to reach the door. He stopped there, turned back, looked at the table where the drawing still lay in the fluorescent light. 12 crayon motorcycles, one stick figure running. He had been that stick figure once, running from a building in Ramadi, running from a sound that stopped, running from the kind of failure that doesn't heal, that doesn't scar over, that stays open and wet and raw for decades because the wound was a child's voice and the silence that followed it. Tonight, he wasn't running from anything. Tonight, he was riding toward it. He stepped into the cold air. The first drops of rain hit his face. Behind him, 11 engines came to life in a rolling cascade of thunder that shook the windows of the clubhouse and sent birds scattering from the dead trees along the road. The storm was coming back, and so were they. They rode in formation through the dark like a wall of sound moving across the earth. 12 motorcycles, headlights cutting white tunnels through rain that had gone from drizzle to downpour in the 20 minutes since they left the clubhouse. Route 11 stretched ahead in a black ribbon of wet asphalt, and the only light besides their own came from distant farmhouses set back from the road like eyes watching from behind curtains. Ryder rode point. He always rode point. His hands were steady on the bars and his face was numb from the cold and the rain, and he could feel every one of his 46 years in his knees and his back and the place behind his eyes where sleep should have been, but wasn't. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. None of them had. Not really. They'd taken shifts, grabbed naps on cots and couches at the clubhouse, but nobody had truly slept because sleeping meant closing your eyes. And closing your eyes meant seeing that drawing, and seeing that drawing meant waking up with your fists clenched and your heart hammering against your ribs like something trying to escape. They reached the stretch of Route 11 that ran past the Harrington property at 9:14. The Douglas fir tree line was a black wall against a blacker sky. Behind it, through the narrowest gap between the trunks, Ryder could see a single light. Yellow, faint. A window somewhere deep inside the property. Someone was still home. He pulled to the shoulder, cut his engine. One by one, 11 more engines died behind him, and the sudden silence was so complete it felt like pressure, like the air itself was holding its breath. Colt pulled up beside him, visor up, rain streaming down his face. "What's the play?" "We split, 6 on this side. 6 at the east junction where Route 11 meets County Road 4. That's the only other way out unless he goes through the fields, and the fields are mud after this rain. Nothing short of a tractor's getting through. And then? And then we wait. For how long?" Ryder looked at his phone. No messages from Judge, no word from Helen Marsh or the state AG's office. The warrants were being processed, the state police were being mobilized, but bureaucracy moved at the speed of paperwork, and paperwork didn't know that a little girl was running out of time. "As long as it takes." Colt nodded. He didn't argue. He pulled his visor down and rode east with Brick, Stitch, Deacon, and 2 others. 6 bikes peeled off into the rain and disappeared around the curve. 6 stayed with Ryder on the shoulder of Route 11, engines off, lights off, 12 legs straddling 6 machines in the dark, like statues carved from leather and exhaust. The rain fell. Time passed in irregular increments, measured not by clocks but by the weight of water soaking through denim and the slow cramping of fingers gripping handlebars for too long. 10 minutes, 20, 40, an hour. At 10:22, Ryder's phone buzzed. A text from Judge, warrant signed, State Police en route. ETA 2 hours. Marsh says hold position. 2 hours. Ryder stared at the screen. Rain blurred the words. He wiped the screen with his thumb and read them again. 2 hours was a lifetime. 2 hours was the difference between a child in a house and a child in a van. 2 hours was the distance between rescue and disappearance, between a name in a file and a ghost in a system that had already lost 4 children it was supposed to protect. He pocketed the phone, looked at the tree line. The yellow light behind the firs was still burning. Someone was still there. Then, at 10:41, the light went out. Ryder sat up straight. Beside him, a biker named Grease, the club's mechanic, 44 years old, hands permanently stained with motor oil, and a voice like gravel in a blender, tapped his arm and pointed. Movement behind the tree line. Headlights. Not the sedan. The van. The white van with no plates that Brick's surveillance team had reported earlier. It was moving down the driveway toward the gate. Ryder's heart rate didn't change. It stayed at 62 beats per minute, the same rate it had held during mortar attacks and ambushes and the kind of moments that turned other men into statues. His body had learned long ago that panic was a luxury reserved for people who had never been in real danger. "He's moving," he said. Quiet. To the men beside him. "Nobody moves until I move. Nobody speaks until I speak." The van reached the gate. The gate was still open from this morning. The headlights swung right, toward Route 11, toward the highway, toward escape. The van turned onto the road. Its tires hissed on the wet asphalt. It accelerated, and then it stopped. Because standing in the middle of Route 11, 20 yards ahead, were 6 motorcycles with their headlights on. Ryder had moved without conscious decision. He'd kicked his engine to life and rolled his bike into the center of the lane and turned his headlight on, and the 5 men beside him had done the same. And now 6 beams of white light illuminated the front of the van like a spotlight on a stage where the final act was about to begin. The van idled. Its wipers beat back and forth. Through the rain-smeared windshield, Ryder could see a face behind the wheel. Not Calvin's face. Someone else. A man he didn't recognize, heavy-set, buzz-cut. The kind of face that had been hired rather than born. The driver's side window rolled down 2 inches. A voice came out, rough, irritated, the voice of a man who expected the road to be empty. "Move!" Ryder didn't move. He sat on his idling Harley with rain streaming off his shoulders and his headlight locked on the van, and he said nothing. The 5 men beside him said nothing. They were a wall, leather and chrome and engine heat and the absolute immovable certainty of men who had decided that this road ended here, tonight, for anyone trying to take a child into the dark. The driver's window rolled up. The van sat. A minute passed. 2. The wipers kept beating. Then the passenger door opened and Calvin Reeves stepped out. He looked different. The charcoal overcoat was gone. He was wearing dark clothes, functional, the kind of clothes a man wears when he's planning to drive through the night and not stop until geography becomes anonymity. His face was composed, but his eyes were moving fast, scanning the bikes, counting them, calculating. "Mr. Kane," his voice carried across the rain. Steady, controlled, but thinner than it had been on the phone. The polish was starting to crack. "You're obstructing a public road. That's a misdemeanor in this state." Ryder stayed on his bike. "So is filing false custody documents, but I'm told that's more of a felony." The words landed like a slap. Calvin's face tightened. A micro-expression, there and gone in less than a second, but Ryder caught it the way a sniper catches a muzzle flash. Fear. Genuine fear. The fear of a man who has just realized that the people in front of him know his real name. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Warren." One word. Calvin's no. Selby's composure cracked like ice under a boot heel. He took a half step back, then stopped, recovered, rebuilt the mask. But the damage was done. Both men knew it. "You're making a serious mistake," Selby said. "I've contacted the sheriff. He's on his way." "Good. He can help direct traffic." Selby stared at him. Rain ran down his face and he didn't wipe it away. "What do you want?" "Where's Emma?" "She's at home. She's asleep." "Then what's in the van?" Selby's jaw worked. "Personal belongings. I'm relocating some items to a storage facility." At 11 at night, in a rainstorm, in a van with no plates. "That's none of your concern." Ryder shifted on his bike. Not towards Selby, not away, just a shift, the kind a man makes when he's settling in for a long stay. You're right, it's not my concern. It's the state attorney general's concern. She's very interested in your work, Warren, especially the work you did in West Virginia, under Ridgeline Asset Management, with those 6 children. The mask didn't just crack this time. It shattered. Selby's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: shock, calculation, and something feral, something that lived behind the expensive haircuts and the tailored clothes, the real face of a man who had built his entire existence on the exploitation of children who had no one left to protect them. "You don't have anything," Selby said. But his voice had changed. The smooth, professional tone was gone. What replaced it was thin, quick, the voice of a cornered animal. "We have Hollister." The name hit Selby like a physical blow. He actually staggered, 1 step back. His heel caught the edge of the road where asphalt met gravel, and he nearly fell. He caught himself on the van's side mirror and stood there, gripping it, rain hammering his head. And for a moment, Ryder saw him clearly. Not as a predator, not as a con man, not as a monster in a pressed shirt, but as a small, desperate man whose entire architecture of deception was collapsing around him in real time. "Hollister is a disgraced lawyer looking to save himself," Selby said. "Nothing he says will hold up." "Maybe, maybe not. But the financial records will. The forged Social Security number will. The 4 other children whose trust funds disappeared will. And the 2 children who disappeared entirely." Ryder's voice dropped to something barely above the sound of the rain. "Where are they, Warren? The 2 nobody can find. Where did they go?" Selby's face went blank. Not composed. Blank. The way a screen goes blank when the system crashes. He stared at Ryder for 5 full seconds without blinking, rain streaming into his eyes, and then he turned and got back in the van and slammed the door. The van's engine revved. The driver put it in reverse. It backed up 20 feet, then stopped. Through the windshield, Ryder could see Selby talking to the driver, gesturing, pointing. The driver shook his head. Selby pointed again, harder. The driver hesitated, then put the van in gear. It lurched forward, not fast, not slow. A deliberate testing pace aimed directly at the line of motorcycles. Ryder didn't move. The van kept coming. 20 yards. 15. 10. Beside him, grease shifted. "Ryder, hold." 8 yards. The van's headlights were blinding. The engine was a low growl. The wipers beat like a metronome, counting down to something irreversible. "Ryder." Grease again, louder. "Hold." 5 yards. 4. The heat from the van's engine was mixing with the cold rain and creating a wall of steam between the machine and the men. Ryder could see the driver's face now. The man was sweating. His hands were white on the wheel. He didn't want to do this. He was hired muscle, not a killer, and the difference between the two was the difference between a man who threatens and a man who follows through. 3 yards. The van stopped. The engine idled. The wipers beat. Rain hammered the roof. And then, slowly, the van's reverse lights came on, and it backed up and stopped, and sat in the middle of Route 11, like a trapped animal that had just discovered the cage was smaller than it thought. Ryder's phone buzzed. A text from Colt at the East Junction. "Sedan just tried County Road 4. We're blocking." He turned back. So there were 2 vehicles. The van heading west. The sedan heading east. Both blocked. Both trapped. Selby was splitting his escape, hedging his bets, trying both exits simultaneously. Which vehicle had Emma? The question detonated in Ryder's chest. He grabbed his phone and called Colt. "The sedan. Did you see who's driving?" Colt's voice came back broken by wind and rain. "One driver. Male. Not Calvin. Couldn't see the back seat. Windows are tinted. She could be in either vehicle." "I know." Ryder looked at the van, looked at his phone. 2 vehicles, 2 groups of bikers, 1 child, and no way to know where she was. "Colt, hold your position. Do not let that sedan leave. I don't care what the driver says. I don't care if the sheriff shows up. That car does not move." "Copy." He pocketed the phone. The van sat idling in front of him. The rain fell harder. And somewhere in the dark, in one of 2 vehicles, A little girl who drew motorcycles in crayon was being transported like cargo by a man who had made 4 other children's money disappear and made 2 of the children disappear with it. At 11:17, the first blue lights appeared on Route 11. Not from the direction Ryder expected. Not from town. From the opposite direction. From the highway. 3 state police cruisers in formation, lights flashing, no sirens, moving at speed through the rain like sharks cutting through dark water. Behind them, 2 unmarked sedans, and behind those, a black SUV with federal plates. Helen Marsh had delivered. The cruisers reached the van first. They fanned out, one on each side, one behind, boxing it in with professional precision. Doors opened. Officers emerged in rain gear and tactical vests. Flashlights swept the van. Commands were issued, loud and clear and legal. Driver, turn off the engine. Both occupants, hands visible. Do not exit the vehicle. The van's engine died. The wipers stopped. The silence that replaced them was the silence of inevitability. A woman stepped out of the lead unmarked sedan. Mid-50s, short gray hair plastered to her skull by the rain, a face that looked like it had been arguing with powerful men for decades and winning more often than losing. She wore a dark jacket with a badge clipped to the belt, and she walked toward the van with the stride of someone who had been waiting 18 months for this moment. Helen Marsh. She didn't look at the bikers, she looked at the van. She spoke to the lead officer. Documents were produced, warrants. The officer read them, nodded, and moved to the van's rear doors. Open the vehicle, he commanded. The driver's door opened. The hired man came out with his hands raised. He was cuffed without resistance. The passenger door opened and Selby emerged, and Ryder watched the transformation happen in real time. The cornered animal retreating behind the mask of the respectable citizen, the smile reappearing, the hands opening in a gesture of cooperation. Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Calvin Reeves. I'm a resident of this county. I have legal custody of— Your name is Warren David Selby, Helen Marsh said, stepping into his path. You are wanted for questioning in connection with custodial fraud, identity theft, and the financial exploitation of minor children across 3 states. You have the right to remain silent. Selby's smile didn't fade. It froze. It stayed on his face like something painted there, and behind it, in his eyes, Ryder saw a man watching his entire world collapse in the rain on a county road in the middle of nowhere, while 6 bikers sat on their motorcycles and a woman with a badge spoke the words that ended everything he had built. The officers opened the van's rear doors. Flashlights swept the interior. File boxes, laptop bags, 2 suitcases, financial documents visible through open box lids. The guts of a criminal operation, packed and ready to vanish. No child. Ryder's stomach dropped. She's not in the van. Helen Marsh turned to him for the first time. Her eyes were sharp, quick, the eyes of someone who processed information the way a computer processes code. Where's the other vehicle? East Junction, County Road 4. My men are blocking it. Marsh spoke into a radio. 2 cruisers broke off and headed east, lights blazing, tearing through the rain at a speed that said they understood what was at stake. Ryder kicked his engine to life. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for protocol. He rode east on Route 11 with the throttle open and the rain hitting his face like gravel and the engine screaming beneath him. And behind him he heard other bikes firing up, Grease and the others following, because no one was going to sit on the shoulder of a road and wait for radio confirmation when a child might be in the back of a car driven by a man who knew the game was over and had nothing left to lose. He reached the East Junction in 4 minutes. The cruisers were already there. Blue lights strobed across the wet road, turning the rain into flashing curtains of blue and white. The sedan was stopped at an angle across County Road 4, its driver's door open, the engine still running. Colt and his group had their bikes positioned in a V formation across the intersection, headlights blazing, engines rumbling, 6 men who had held their ground for over an hour in the freezing rain without moving. The driver of the sedan was face down on the wet asphalt, 2 officers kneeling on his back, cuffing him. He was shouting something about lawyers and rights and mistakes. Nobody was listening. Ryder jumped off his bike before it was fully stopped. It toppled onto its side in the gravel. He didn't care. He ran to the sedan, past the officers, past the driver, to the rear door, tinted windows. He couldn't see inside. His hand closed around the door handle. An officer shouted something at him. He didn't hear it. He didn't hear anything except his own heartbeat and the rain and a sound from 20 years ago. A sound from a collapsed building in Ramadi. A child's voice calling from beneath concrete and rebar, calling and calling until it stopped. He opened the door. The back seat was empty. No, not empty. Almost empty. A blanket, a child's shoe. One shoe, small, pink, the Velcro strap torn. And on the seat beside it, a composition notebook with a crayon drawing on the cover. Another house with no doors, another stick figure inside. But Emma was not there. Ryder stood in the rain holding the car door open, staring at the empty seat, and felt something inside his chest give way. Not break. Give way. The way a dam gives way. The way a foundation gives way. The pressure of 36 hours without sleep and a lifetime of carrying the weight of the ones he couldn't save pressed down on him so hard that his vision blurred and his knees almost buckled, and for one terrible moment he was back in Ramadi, back on his hands and knees, digging, bleeding, listening to a sound that was getting weaker. "She's not here." His voice came out wrong, torn. "She's not in either vehicle." Colt was beside him. "The house. She's still at the house." Ryder turned, looked back west. Route 11 disappeared into the rain and the dark toward the Harrington property, toward the Douglas fir tree line, toward the security cameras and the bolted windows, and the house with no doors that a little girl had drawn because she couldn't say the words. He was on his bike before his next heartbeat. The engine caught, and he was moving, tearing west on Route 11 at 70 miles an hour in the rain, the yellow center line a blur beneath his wheels. And behind him he heard other engines, but he didn't count them. He didn't look. He rode with his head down and his hands locked on the bars and the taste of iron in his mouth from where he'd bitten through the inside of his cheek without realizing it. The Harrington property gate was open. He turned in. The gravel driveway was a river of mud. His rear tire slid. He caught it. The Douglas firs closed around him like a tunnel, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking the rain, creating a cathedral of darkness and the smell of wet pine. The house appeared. 2 stories. Dark. Every window black. Every door closed. It looked abandoned. It looked like a place where things were hidden, not a place where people lived. Ryder killed his engine. The silence was absolute. Behind him, other bikes arrived and died. Officers were coming. He could see blue lights reflecting off the fir trees from the road. But they were behind him, and the house was in front of him, and somewhere inside that dark structure was either an empty room or a child who had been left behind by a man fleeing in the night. He ran to the front door, tried the handle, locked. He slammed his shoulder into it. The frame cracked, but held. He hit it again. Wood splintered. The door gave way on the third impact, and he stumbled inside. Dark. Cold. The smell hit him first. Bleach and something underneath it. Something stale and human. The smell of a space that had been sealed too long with too little air. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across an entry hall. Clean, sparse. No photographs on the walls, no coats on the hooks. The furniture was minimal and functional, the kind of furniture found in a space designed to be left behind. "Emma!" His voice echoed through empty rooms. "Emma, it's Ryder. From the diner." Silence. The house absorbed his voice and gave nothing back. He moved through the ground floor, kitchen, living room, a study with an empty desk and open drawers. The file boxes were gone, loaded into the van. Everything that mattered to Calvin Reeves had been packed. Everything that didn't matter had been left, including, potentially, a child. Stairs. He took them 2 at a time. His boots were loud on the hardwood, and each step sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Second floor, hallway, 3 doors. 2 open, 1 closed. He opened the first door. A bedroom. Adult. The bed was stripped. The closet was empty. Nothing. The second door. A bathroom. Clean, white. The medicine cabinet was open and empty. The third door. Closed. A padlock on the outside. A padlock on the outside of a bedroom door. Ryder stared at it. The chrome gleamed in his phone's flashlight beam. A padlock. On the outside. Of a room in a house where a child lived. You don't lock a door from the outside to keep something out. You lock it from the outside to keep something in. He grabbed the lock, pulled. It held. He looked around, found a fire extinguisher mounted on the hallway wall, pulled it free, swung it. The lock broke on the second strike. The hasp tore free from the door frame. The door swung inward. The room was small. 8 by 8, maybe? A single mattress on the floor, no frame, no sheets, just a mattress with a thin blanket folded neatly at one end. A plastic cup on the floor beside it. A bucket in the corner. No toys, no books, no window, just a frame where a window had been, boarded shut from the outside with plywood. A single nail head visible in the flashlight beam. And on the wall, drawn in crayon, covering every inch of available space from floor to eye level of a child who stood about 4 feet tall, were drawings. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Drawn directly on the drywall in every color of crayon that an 8-year-old could find. Houses with no doors. Stick figures behind bars. Rain clouds. Motorcycles. Over and over motorcycles. Some with riders, some without. Some drawn carefully with 2 wheels and handlebars, and even tiny exhaust pipes. Some drawn fast, scribbled, desperate, the crayon pressed so hard it had gouged into the drywall. And in the center of the wall, larger than the others, surrounded by all the motorcycles, a single figure. Not a stick figure this time. A person, drawn with the fierce, trembling detail of a child who was trying to remember what freedom looked like. Arms up, legs running, hair streaming behind, a face with a smile that was more wish than memory. The figure was running toward the motorcycles. The figure was running out of the house. The figure was Emma, drawn by Emma, imagined by Emma, on the walls of a room that had been her prison for 2 years. But Emma was not in the room. The mattress was cold. The blanket was folded. The cup was empty. She was gone. Ryder stood in that room with his flashlight shaking in his hand and the drawing staring back at him from every wall and the sound of his own breathing filling the space like something mechanical. And for 5 seconds he was nowhere. He was in no country, in no time. He was just a man standing in a room where a child had been kept and was no longer, and the emptiness of it was so complete it had its own gravity. Then, from below, Colt's voice, calling his name. Not shouting, calling. The medic's voice, the one that meant something had been found. Ryder turned, went down the stairs, followed the voice through the kitchen to a back door he hadn't noticed. The door was open. Beyond it, a porch. Beyond the porch, darkness. Rain. The fir trees. Colt was standing at the edge of the porch, his flashlight pointed at the ground. In the mud beyond the bottom step, a trail of small footprints. Barefoot. Leading away from the house and into the trees. She ran, Colt said. His voice was thick. When she heard him packing, when she heard the van, she ran. Ryder looked at the footprints. They were filling with water. The rain was erasing them in real time. In 20 minutes, they would be gone. In 20 minutes, there would be no trace of which direction an 8-year-old barefoot girl had gone in a thunderstorm in the dark in October on 60 acres of forest. He stepped off the porch into the mud. The rain hit him full force. Behind him, other men were arriving. Brick, Stitch, Deacon. Officers with flashlights. Helen Marsh's voice on a radio calling for search and rescue. But Ryder didn't wait for search and rescue. He followed the footprints. Small. Impossibly small. Pressed into the mud between the fir trees where the branches blocked some of the rain, and the earth was soft and dark, and held the shape of a child's foot like a mold waiting to be cast. He walked. Then he ran. The footprints curved left, away from the driveway, deeper into the property, toward the back acres where the tree line was thickest. His flashlight beam bounced through the trunks. Rain filled his eyes. Branches whipped his face. He called her name and the trees swallowed it. Then he heard something. Not a voice, not a word. A sound. Small. Thin. Coming from somewhere ahead and to the right. A sound that could have been an animal or the wind or the rain hitting something hollow. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a child breathing, fast, shallow. The breathing of a small body pressed against something solid, trying to be invisible, trying to be nothing, because being nothing was the only defense she had ever been taught. Ryder stopped moving, stopped calling. He turned off his flashlight. He stood in the dark between the fir trees with rain streaming down his face, and he listened to that breathing, and he did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, harder than combat, harder than digging through rubble, harder than walking away from a building when a voice was still calling. He sat down. In the mud, in the rain, in the dark. He sat down on the forest floor, and he made himself small, and he waited. "Emma," he said. Not loud, not a shout, not a command, a voice the size of a grilled cheese sandwich offered to a hungry girl in a diner booth. "Emma, it's Ryder, from the diner, the man with the motorcycle. You drew us. I found your drawing." The breathing didn't change, but it didn't retreat. "You don't have to come out. You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to sit here, in the mud, in the rain. I'm getting very wet and very cold, and I probably look ridiculous, but I'm going to sit here because I told you I'd come back." Silence. Rain. The distant sound of radios and engines and men calling to each other back at the house. "You drew 12 motorcycles, Emma. I counted them. 12. And you got it right. There are 12 of us, and every single one of us is here tonight because of your drawing." A sound. Not breathing, not wind. A voice. Tiny, broken, coming from behind the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, 8 feet to his right. He said nobody would come. 5 words. And each one carried the weight of 2 years of darkness and fear and a locked door and a wall covered in crayon drawings of a freedom she had never stopped believing in, even when everything around her said it didn't exist. "He was wrong," Ryder said. Silence. 10 seconds. 20. The rain fell and fell, and the mud soaked through his jeans, and the cold climbed into his bones, and he didn't move, didn't reach, didn't stand, because this wasn't his moment. This was hers. This was the moment a child who had been told she was nothing decided whether to believe the man sitting in the mud or the monster who had locked her door. And then, from behind the tree, slowly, so slowly it barely registered as movement, a small figure emerged, barefoot, shivering, the gray hoodie soaked through and clinging to a frame so thin it looked like it might snap in the wind. Mud on her knees, on her hands, on her face, eyes so wide they reflected the distant blue lights filtering through the trees. Emma Hart. She stood there, 4 feet away, shaking, looking at him with an expression that Ryder would carry for the rest of his life, an expression that contained equal parts terror and hope, as if she was holding both in her hands and waiting to see which one the world would ask her to drop. Ryder didn't stand, didn't reach. He sat in the mud and he looked at her, and he said the only thing that mattered. "You can choose, Emma, right now. You can stay right there. You can run. You can do whatever you want. But if you want to come with me, I am going to pick you up and carry you out of these woods, and no one is ever going to lock a door on you again." She didn't move. The rain fell between them like a curtain. Then she took 1 step, and another, and another. And on the 4th step she was running, and on the 5th her arms were out, and on the 6th she hit him like a small, soaking, shaking force of nature, and her arms went around his neck, and her face pressed into his shoulder, and a sound came out of her that wasn't crying and wasn't screaming. It was something older than both, something that had been locked inside a room with no windows for 2 years and was finally breaking free. Ryder caught her, wrapped his arms around her, stood up with her weight against his chest, and she weighed nothing. She weighed absolutely nothing. And that fact alone was enough to crack something inside him that he had been holding together with willpower and silence for 20 years. He carried her through the trees, toward the lights, toward the voices, toward 12 men who were standing in the rain at the edge of the forest, waiting, watching, and when they saw him emerge from the tree line with the girl in his arms, not one of them spoke. Brick took off his leather jacket and draped it around Emma without being asked. It covered her entirely. She disappeared inside it like a small animal burrowing into something warm and safe. Deacon turned away. His shoulders shook. Nobody pretended not to notice. Colt stepped forward with a medic's hands and a medic's eyes and checked her pulse and her breathing and the temperature of her skin. And when he looked up at Ryder, his face said everything his voice couldn't. She was alive. She was hypothermic and malnourished and covered in bruises that would take weeks to catalog and months to heal. But she was alive, and she was out. And the man who had put her in that room was face down on wet asphalt 2 miles away with his hands cuffed behind his back and the weight of 3 states' worth of charges pressing down on him like the earth pressing down on a coffin. Emma didn't let go of Ryder's neck. Not when the paramedics arrived, not when the blankets came, not when Helen Marsh knelt beside them and spoke in a voice gentler than anything Ryder would have expected from a woman who had just dismantled a criminal operation in a thunderstorm. "Emma," Marsh said, "my name is Helen. You're safe now. Do you understand? You are safe." Emma's face stayed buried in Ryder's shoulder. Her voice came out muffled, small, but clear. "He said nobody would come." "A lot of people came," Marsh said. Emma lifted her head, just enough to look past Ryder's shoulder, past the paramedics, past the officers. To the edge of the driveway where 12 motorcycles stood in the rain, their chrome catching the blue lights, their engines silent, their riders standing shoulder to shoulder in a line that stretched across the gravel like a wall that nothing and no one would ever breach. She looked at them for a long time. Then she pressed her face back into Ryder's shoulder and held on tighter, and the sound she made was not the sound of a child who had been rescued. It was the sound of a child who had just learned that the drawings on her wall were not just wishes. They were prophecies. The ambulance took Emma to Harlan County General at 12:43 in the morning. Ryder rode behind it, not because anyone asked him to, not because protocol allowed it, because when the paramedics tried to separate Emma from his arms to place her on the gurney, she had locked her fingers into the collar of his vest with a grip that defied every physical limitation of her malnourished body, and the only way to get her onto the stretcher was for Ryder to lay her down himself, peel her fingers free one by one, and promise her, with his face 6 inches from hers and his voice barely above a whisper, that he would be right behind her and that the ambulance would not leave his sight. She let go, but her eyes stayed on his through the rear window as the ambulance pulled away, and Ryder saw in those eyes something he recognized from mirrors he had stopped looking into years ago, the absolute certainty that anyone who leaves will not come back. He followed the ambulance at 40 miles an hour through empty roads. The rain had finally stopped. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine, and the cold mineral tang of a world that had been washed clean and was waiting to see what would grow in the morning. At the hospital, they wouldn't let him pass the emergency department doors. Policy. He wasn't family. He wasn't a legal guardian. He was a man in a soaked leather vest with mud on his boots and blood on his hands from where he'd torn them on the padlock hasp, and the look of someone who had not slept in 2 days and might not sleep for 2 more. A nurse named Clara, mid-50s, built like a woman who had spent her career lifting patients and arguing with insurance companies, stood between him and the doors with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and steel. "You can't go back there," I promised her. "I understand, but I need you to sit down. I need you to let the doctors work, and I need you to trust that she's safe. She's been told she's safe before, by people who locked her in a room." Clara didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. She'd seen worse. She worked the night shift in a rural emergency department, which meant she had seen every kind of human damage the world could produce, and had learned to stand in front of it without being destroyed. "I'm going to bring you coffee," she said, "and I'm going to check on her every 15 minutes and come back and tell you exactly what's happening. That's what I can do. Is that enough?" It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough. But Ryder nodded because he recognized in Clara the same quality he valued in his own men, competence held steady by compassion. He sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room and he accepted the coffee and he stared at the double doors and he waited. Colt arrived 20 minutes later, then Brick, then Stitch. One by one, the Iron Saints filtered into the waiting room of Harlan County General until there were 12 men in wet leather occupying every available chair and 3 spots along the wall, their boots leaving mud tracks on the linoleum, their presence filling the fluorescent-lit space with the smell of rain and exhaust, and the particular silence of men who are too tired to talk and too wired to sleep. The night shift staff navigated around them without complaint. Whatever they thought of 12 bikers in their waiting room at 1 in the morning, they kept it to themselves. Clara brought more coffee. A security guard looked in once, assessed the situation, and left without saying a word. At 2:15, Clara came back through the double doors. Ryder was on his feet before she'd taken 3 steps. "She's stable," Clara said. "Hypothermic but responding to warming. Malnourished, dehydrated, multiple contusions in various stages of healing. She paused, chose her next words with the care of a woman who had delivered bad news 1,000 times and never gotten used to it. The markings on her back, the doctors have documented them. They appear to be a tracking system of some kind. Dates, numbers, corresponding to injuries. Another pause. Some of the marks go back at least 18 months. Ryder didn't move. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very dark and very still, the way the ocean goes still before a wave that will reshape the coastline. "She's asking for you," Clara added. "The man with the motorcycle. That's what she keeps saying. She wants the man with the motorcycle." Clara looked at the 12 men in her waiting room. She looked at the mud on her floor and the coffee cups on her tables and the sheer physical mass of a motorcycle club that had taken over her emergency department in the middle of the night. "5 minutes," she said. "One person. And if Dr. Reese tells you to leave, you leave." Ryder followed her through the doors, down a hallway lit by that particular hospital fluorescence that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly too bright, as if the light itself is trying too hard, past curtained bays and the sounds of machines and the quiet murmur of nurses changing shifts. Emma was in the last bay. A curtain partitioned her from the rest of the department. She was lying on a hospital bed that was too big for her, wrapped in heated blankets, an IV line in her left hand delivering fluids that her body had been denied for longer than any child's body should be denied anything. Her eyes were open. They tracked him the moment he came around the curtain. He pulled a chair to the bedside, sat down. His knees cracked. His back ached. His hands throbbed where the skin had torn. He was the most exhausted he had been since Ramadi, and that was saying something because Ramadi had nearly killed him. "Hey, kid." She looked at him. In the hospital light, without the oversized hoodie and the darkness and the rain, she looked even smaller than he remembered. Her face was a geography of damage, pale skin stretched tight over bones that were too prominent, dark circles under eyes that were too large, a split on her lower lip that had scabbed over and been split again at least twice. "You came back," she said, as if confirming a fact she still couldn't fully believe. "I told you I would." He said people always say that. He said it's just something adults say to make kids stop crying. Ryder leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, looked at her at eye level, the way you look at someone you're speaking to as an equal, not as a child, not as a victim, but as a human being who has earned the right to be spoken to directly. Some adults lie. That's true. Some adults say things they don't mean because it's easier than doing the hard thing. He paused. "But Emma, I rode through a thunderstorm, sat in mud, broke down a door, and walked through a forest in the dark to find you. If I was the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, I would have stayed in the diner and finished my burger." Something happened on her face. Not a smile. Not yet. Smiles would take time, weeks, months, maybe longer. But something shifted in the architecture of her expression. Some tiny weight lifted from some tiny place, and for half a second she looked like what she was supposed to look like. A child. Just a child. Tired and hurt and small, but a child nonetheless. "My mom used to say that too," she whispered. "That she'd always come back." "Your mom sounds like she was a good person." "She made pancakes on Saturdays at the diner with Doris." "I heard about that." Emma's eyes drifted to the IV in her hand. She stared at it with the detached curiosity of someone who has spent so long in pain that medical intervention feels like a foreign language. "Is he gone?" she asked. "Calvin. He's gone. He's in custody. He's not coming back. He'll get out. He always gets out. He told me that. He said he has lawyers and money and that no one can touch him." "He doesn't have lawyers anymore, Emma. He doesn't have money. And the people who are coming for him aren't from this county. They're from the state, from the federal government. He's not getting out." She processed this, slowly, the way someone processes sunlight after years in a dark room. Not with joy, with caution. Because when you've been living in darkness, light hurts before it heals. "Where will I go?" she asked. The question was so simple and so enormous that Ryder didn't answer it immediately. Because the honest answer was that he didn't know. Because the system that had failed her, the courts that had signed off on forged custody documents, the CPS that had closed investigations, The sheriff who had taken donations and looked away. That system was now supposed to protect her. And Ryder had spent enough of his life watching systems fail to know that the honest answer was the hardest one to give. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know this. You will not go back to that house. You will not go to anyone who hurts you, and you will not be alone." "How do you know?" He looked at the curtain. Beyond it, in the waiting room, 12 men were sitting in plastic chairs with cold coffee and muddy boots, waiting for news about a girl most of them had met 24 hours ago. Because there are 12 very large, very stubborn men sitting in that waiting room who are not going to leave this hospital until they know you're okay. And when you leave, they're not going to disappear. That's not what they do. What do? They show up. That's what they do. They show up, and they don't leave. Clara returned at the 5-minute mark. Ryder stood, looked at Emma, and did something he hadn't planned. He took the Iron Saints patch pin from the inside of his vest pocket, a small enamel pin that every member carried as a spare, and set it on the table beside her bed. "Hold on to that for me," he said. "I'll come get it when you're ready." Emma picked up the pin, held it in her palm, closed her fingers around it. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't wave. She held the pin and she watched him leave, and her eyes stayed dry because she had learned at 8 years old that tears were a currency she couldn't afford. But she held that pin so tight it left a mark in her palm. And when the nurse came to check her vitals 30 minutes later, she was asleep with it still in her fist. The days that followed moved at the speed of institutions. Slow, methodical. Indifferent to the urgency of human pain, Helen Marsh's investigation expanded. Warren David Selby, formerly Calvin Reeves, formerly at least 2 other identities that Stitch uncovered in the weeks that followed, was charged with 18 federal counts, including custodial fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation of minors, and child abuse. His hired driver, a man named Terrence Poole, cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges and provided details about Selby's operations that filled in the gaps Hollister's testimony had left. The 2 missing children from Selby's earlier cases were found, both alive. One had been placed with a family in Ohio through an illegal private adoption arranged by Hollister. The other had been abandoned at a bus station in Kentucky when Selby decided the child was too old to be useful. A janitor at the station had found the boy sleeping under a bench and called social services. The boy had been in foster care for 3 years under a different name, his real identity lost in the same paperwork labyrinth that Selby had exploited to steal his money. Judge made the calls, tracked the records, sat in the back room of the clubhouse with the landline pressed to his ear for hours at a time, his legal training rising from the grave of his career like something that had been buried alive and was finally digging its way to the surface. He didn't talk about the boy with the garden hose. He didn't have to. Everyone in the club understood that what Judge was doing now, the meticulous, exhausting, unglamorous work of following paper trails and arguing with bureaucrats, was not just about Emma. It was about every child he hadn't been able to save. It was about redemption disguised as procedure. Sheriff Pruitt was investigated by the state police for failure to act on reports of child abuse. He resigned before the investigation concluded. The diner, the feed store, the post office. The entire town processed this information the way small towns process uncomfortable truths, slowly, with a lot of silence and a lot of looking at shoes and a lot of sentences that began with, "I always thought something was wrong, but..." The but was always where the sentence died. Linda Chen came out of retirement. Not to teach, she didn't have the energy for that anymore, but she testified. In depositions and hearings and one long afternoon in a federal courtroom where she sat in the witness chair and described, in the steady voice of a woman who had been waiting 14 months to say these words to someone who would actually listen, the drawing of a house with no doors that a child had torn into pieces and eaten rather than let anyone see. The courtroom was silent when she finished. The judge, a woman from the Capitol with reading glasses, and the expression of someone who had seen enough to know that the law was both a sword and a shield, and that the trick was knowing which end to hold, thanked Linda Chen and dismissed her. Selby's trial lasted 3 weeks. He was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 42 years. He would die in prison. The charcoal overcoat and the pressed shirts would be replaced by orange, And the man who had built his life on the invisibility of orphaned children would spend the rest of it in a place where he himself was invisible, numbered, cataloged, just another entry in a system that no longer cared what he wanted. Emma's trust fund was recovered, not all of it. Selby had drained approximately $900,000 before the arrest. But the remainder, just over $3 million, was placed under the management of a court-appointed trustee recommended by Helen Marsh's office, a woman with a reputation for incorruptibility and a personal history that included growing up in foster care herself. And Emma found a home. It didn't happen quickly. It didn't happen easily. The system moved at its own speed, indifferent to the wishes of 12 bikers who had opinions about where an 8-year-old girl should live. There were evaluations, assessments, home studies, background checks. The machinery of child welfare grinding through its gears with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of an institution that had failed catastrophically and was now overcorrecting with caution. Grace and Thomas Bennett lived on 40 acres of horse country an hour north of Harlan County. Grace was a retired pediatric nurse. Thomas was a large animal veterinarian who had hands the size of dinner plates and a voice so gentle that horses followed him around like dogs. They had fostered 7 children over 15 years. They had adopted 2. Their home was a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that always smelled like bread, and a barn with 4 horses and a dog named Captain who was missing 1 ear from a coyote encounter and who slept on the porch regardless of weather. Emma met them on a Tuesday in November. Ryder drove her, not on his motorcycle, in Colt's truck, because November in horse country is no place for a child on a bike. Emma sat in the back seat with the Iron Saints pin in her pocket and her hands folded in her lap and the expression of someone walking into yet another room controlled by yet another adult who would decide the shape of her life. Grace Bennett was waiting on the porch. She didn't rush forward. She didn't kneel down with open arms and a manufactured smile. She sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and Captain beside her, and she waited for Emma to come to her. Emma didn't come to her. Not at first. She stood beside the truck for 3 full minutes, looking at the house, the porch, the horses in the distant pasture, the dog with 1 ear. She looked at it the way a prisoner looks at an open door, not with hope, but with suspicion, because open doors had always been traps. Then Captain got up, walked down the steps, crossed the yard, and sat down in front of Emma with his tongue out and his remaining ear cocked sideways and his tail sweeping the dirt behind him like a metronome set to the tempo of unconditional acceptance. Emma looked at the dog. The dog looked at Emma. And something happened that Ryder would remember for the rest of his life. Something so small that no courtroom would ever record it, and no newspaper would ever report it. But that mattered more than verdicts and sentences and recovered trust funds. Emma knelt down and put her arms around the dog and pressed her face into his neck, and the dog held absolutely still, as if he understood that this was not a moment for movement, but for presence, for the simple physical fact of warmth and heartbeat, and another living thing that was choosing to be close. Grace watched from the porch. She didn't move. She sipped her coffee. She let the dog do what dogs do better than any human institution ever built. Ryder left an hour later. Emma didn't cling. She didn't cry. She stood on the porch with Captain beside her and Grace behind her, and she watched the truck pull away with an expression that was not goodbye, but rather something closer to a question mark. A pause. A held breath. He came back the following Saturday. And the Saturday after that. And the Saturday after that. The Iron Saints didn't disappear from Emma's life the way every other adult had disappeared. They appeared, regularly, predictably, with the reliability of weather patterns and the stubbornness of men who had decided that showing up was the only thing that mattered, and then showed up. Brick taught her to change a tire, not because an 8-year-old needed to change tires, but because an 8-year-old who had been told she was helpless needed to know she could fix things with her own hands. He stood beside her in Thomas Bennett's barn with his massive frame bent over a wheelbarrow tire and his voice, that surprisingly soft voice, walking her through the steps with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nowhere else he wanted to be. Stitch helped her with homework. He sat at the Bennett's kitchen table on Tuesday evenings with his laptop closed and a pencil in his hand and a 6th grade math textbook open between them, because Emma had been pulled out of school for 2 years and was catching up with a ferocity that startled her teachers and didn't surprise the bikers at all. She attacked fractions and long division the way she had attacked the grilled cheese in the diner. Fast, fierce, as if each correct answer was a meal she'd been denied. Deacon came to her school play. He sat in the auditorium of Harlan County Elementary, his tattooed hands folded in his lap, his leather vest drawing stares from parents who shifted in their seats and held their purses tighter. He didn't care. He was there because a 9-year-old girl, she had turned 9 in December in a birthday party that involved 12 bikers and a cake with a motorcycle drawn in frosting, had asked him to come. She had a speaking part. 3 lines. She delivered them in a voice that shook on the first line, steadied on the second, and rang clear across the auditorium on the third. And when she looked at the audience and found Deacon's face in the 3rd row, she smiled. A real smile. The first one Ryder had ever seen reach her eyes. Deacon cried in the parking lot afterward. Not dramatically. Not loudly. He leaned against his bike and wiped his face with the back of his hand, and Colt stood beside him and said nothing because some things don't need words. They just need a man standing next to another man while the world rearranges itself into something slightly more bearable. Judge closed the last of the legal files on a Thursday in March. Selby's appeal had been denied. Hollister had been disbarred and sentenced to 3 years for his role in the custody fraud. The 2 recovered children had been placed with families. The trust was secure. The case, as the legal system defined it, was over. Judge put his glasses on the desk in the back room of the clubhouse and sat for a long time in the quiet. Then he picked up the phone and called the state bar. Not about Selby, about himself, about reinstatement, about the possibility, however remote, that a man who had been broken by the system could be rebuilt by it. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. When he emerged from the back room, his eyes were red and his hands were steady, and he said nothing to anyone. But the following Monday, he enrolled in a continuing legal education course, and the Monday after that, he filed the paperwork to begin the reinstatement process. Nobody in the club mentioned it. Nobody congratulated him. Nobody asked about it. They simply noticed, in the weeks that followed, that Judge's index finger had stopped tapping. The years passed the way years pass when you're not counting them. Emma grew. The bruises faded. The marks on her back faded. The nightmares didn't fade, not entirely, but they became less frequent, less vivid, less powerful. Grace Bennett sat with her through the bad nights. Thomas Bennett taught her to ride horses and to understand that strength didn't mean force, it meant steadiness. Captain slept at the foot of her bed every night and growled at shadows and dreamed dog dreams with his paws twitching and his one ear flat against his head. She learned to draw again, not on walls, on paper, in sketchbooks that Grace bought her from the art supply store 2 towns over. She drew horses. She drew Captain. She drew the farmhouse with its wraparound porch. She drew houses with doors. Wide open doors. Doors with no locks. Doors that led to porches, that led to yards, that led to roads, that led to everywhere and anywhere. Because a door is not just a piece of architecture. A door is a promise. And Emma Hart, who had spent 2 years in a room where the door locked from the outside, drew doors the way other children drew sunshine. Compulsively, joyfully. As if every door she put on paper was a door she was building in the world. The Iron Saints came to her high school graduation on a June afternoon so bright and warm, it felt like the weather was making up for that October thunderstorm 9 years earlier. They parked their motorcycles in a row at the edge of the school parking lot. 12 Harleys gleaming in the sun, chrome throwing light in every direction. The machines looked older now. The men looked older too. Gray in beards that had been dark. Lines on faces that had been hard and were now hard in a different way. The hardness of wood that has been weathered rather than the hardness of stone that has been cut. Ryder stood at the end of the row. 55 years old. His hair was fully gray now, pulled back under a bandana that had been washed so many times it had lost its original color. His hands were stiffer than they'd been, the knuckles swollen from years of cold rides and engine work. His eyes were the same, dishwater gray, always moving, always reading the room. Colt stood beside him. The titanium plate in his skull ached in the heat. His bad knee made him shift his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't complain. He hadn't complained in 40 years. He wasn't going to start now. Brick Stitch Judge, who was now a practicing attorney again, reinstated 18 months after he filed. Deacon, who had regained custody of his own daughter and brought her today, a teenager with her father's stubborn jaw and her own leather jacket worn with the particular pride of a girl who understood exactly what the man beside her had survived to stand here. They filed into the auditorium and took seats in the front row that Grace Bennett had reserved with a handwritten sign that read simply, "Family." The ceremony was long, speeches, names, the particular tedium of institutional ritual that matters enormously to the people involved and not at all to anyone else. Emma's name was called near the middle of the alphabet. She walked across the stage in a blue gown and a cap that kept sliding to one side, and she collected her diploma, and she looked at the front row, and she saw 12 men who had once stood in a diner at midnight because a little girl asked for leftovers. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She nodded. Once. The way Ryder nodded when something was understood and didn't need to be decorated with words. Then the principal announced that the class valedictorian would deliver the closing address. Emma walked to the podium. She stood there for a moment, looking at the crowd, the parents, the teachers, the classmates, the 12 men in the front row whose leather vests looked out of place among the summer dresses and polo shirts, and whose presence made perfect sense to anyone who knew the story and no sense at all to anyone who didn't. She adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat, and began. When I was 8 years old, I walked up to a stranger in a diner and asked if I could eat the food left on his plate. I was hungry. I was scared. I was wearing a hoodie 3 sizes too big because I needed to hide things I couldn't explain. I had been taught that asking for help was dangerous. I had been taught that adults were people who locked doors and kept records, and that the world was a house with no exit. The auditorium was silent, completely, absolutely silent, the kind of silence that occurs when hundreds of people simultaneously stop breathing. That stranger didn't give me his leftovers. He ordered me a grilled cheese. And that small act, that one decision to see a hungry child and respond with a meal instead of a question, changed everything. Not because a grilled cheese sandwich has any special power, but because the man who ordered it did something that no one had done in 2 years. He noticed, he paid attention, and he didn't look away. Her eyes found Ryder's. He was sitting in this front row with his hands on his knees and his jaw tight and his eyes locked on hers. And he was not crying because Ryder Kane did not cry in public. But the muscles in his face were doing something they had never done before, something that looked like the walls of a very old building finally letting sunlight through cracks that had been sealed for decades. People think heroes save lives with strength, with size, with power. People think rescue looks like sirens and uniforms and official documents stamped with official seals. She paused. But sometimes rescue looks like 12 motorcycles in a diner parking lot. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting down in the mud in the rain because a little girl was too scared to stand up. Sometimes it looks like someone coming back on Saturday, and the next Saturday, and the next, not because they had to, because they chose to. She looked at the front row, at 12 faces she had known for nearly half her life, at men who had taught her to change tires and solve fractions and ride a bicycle and trust that a door could be opened from both sides. I'm standing here today because 12 strangers became 12 constants, because they showed up and they didn't stop showing up, because they understood something that the systems built to protect children sometimes forget. She gripped the edges of the podium. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken since that school play at 9 years old when she'd found Deacon's face in the third row and realized that an audience didn't have to be a threat. That showing up is not a single act. It's a decision you make every day. And the people who change your life aren't always the ones with the authority to do it. Sometimes they're the ones with the stubbornness to refuse to leave. She looked at Ryder one more time. Thank you for the grilled cheese. The auditorium erupted. Not politely. Not with the measured applause of a graduation ceremony. It erupted the way a room erupts when something true has been said in a place where truth is usually dressed in platitudes and trimmed to fit a schedule. 12 bikers stood first. Then Grace and Thomas Bennett stood behind them. Then the teachers, the parents, the classmates. Row by row, the auditorium rose until every person in the room was on their feet, and the sound filled the space like something physical, like weather, like the sound of 12 engines on a rain-soaked road at midnight, carrying 12 men toward a child who had drawn her rescue on the walls of her prison and believed it would come. Emma stood at the podium and let the sound wash over her. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin up, and the slight, steady smile of a young woman who had walked through a door that no one could ever lock again. After the ceremony, in the parking lot, in the slanting afternoon light, she found Ryder leaning against his motorcycle with his arms crossed and his bandana soaked with sweat, and the expression of a man who has just been undone by a grilled cheese sandwich and will never fully recover. She reached into the pocket of her graduation gown and pulled out a small enamel pin, an iron saint's pin, worn smooth at the edges from years of being held, carried, clutched in a sleeping child's fist. She held it out to him. "You told me to hold on to this until I was ready." Ryder looked at the pin. Looked at her. The girl who had whispered a request for leftovers was standing in front of him in a graduation gown, 5'7", strong, whole, alive. The bruises were gone. The marks were gone. The hoodie was gone. What remained was a person who had been built, piece by piece, Saturday by Saturday, grilled cheese by grilled cheese, by the accumulated weight of people who showed up and didn't leave. He didn't take the pin. "Keep it," he said. "It's yours." "It was mine. Now it's yours. You earned it harder than I did." Emma closed her hand around the pin, looked at the row of motorcycles gleaming in the sun, looked at 12 men standing beside them, older, grayer, slower, but upright, still standing, still showing up on a Saturday afternoon in June because a girl they'd met in a diner had become a woman they considered family. She didn't hug Ryder. She didn't need to. She stood beside him and leaned against the motorcycle, and they looked at the school and the parking lot and the families loading into cars and the particular chaos of a graduation afternoon, and they existed together in the silence of two people who understood each other in a way that transcended language and ceremony and the neat resolutions that stories are supposed to provide. The truth was messier than that. The truth was that Emma still woke up at 3 in the morning sometimes, that she still checked the locks on her bedroom door, that she still, on certain cold October nights when the rain hit the roof a certain way, drew a house with no doors in the corner of her sketchbook, and then drew an open door over it, covering the old drawing with the new one, layering freedom over imprisonment until the original image disappeared beneath the revision. The truth was that Ryder still didn't sleep well, that he still held unlit cigarettes between his fingers when the memories came, that he still heard, in the quietest moments of the quietest nights, a voice calling from beneath rubble in a city on the other side of the world, and that the voice would never fully go away. But the truth was also this, that the voice was quieter now, that the weight was lighter, that somewhere between the diner and the forest and the hospital and the hundreds of Saturdays that followed, the stone he had carried in his chest for 20 years had not dissolved but had shifted, had found a new position, had settled into a place where he could carry it and still move forward. Emma pushed off the motorcycle, straightened her gown, looked at Ryder with an expression that was not a child's and not quite an adult's, but something in between, something that belonged uniquely to people who had grown up too fast and were now growing back into the years they'd missed. "Same diner next Saturday?" she asked. Ryder looked at her, at the pin in her hand, at the 12 motorcycles and the 12 men in the afternoon light falling across all of it like a hand laid gently on a wound. "Same diner," he said. "Same booth." She walked away across the parking lot toward Grace and Thomas and Captain, who was hanging his head out of the truck window with his one ear up and his tail going like a propeller. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Ryder watched her go. He stood there until the truck pulled out of the lot and turned onto the road and disappeared around the curve. Then he swung his leg over his bike and hit the ignition, and the engine came to life beneath him with a sound like a heartbeat that had been waiting for permission to resume. 11 other engines followed, one by one, the way they always did, the way they always would. 12 motorcycles pulled out of a high school parking lot on a Saturday afternoon in June and rode toward a roadside diner on Route 11 where a waitress named Doris was already pouring coffee and a booth by the window was waiting and the jukebox was playing an old country song about highways and heartbreak and the long road home. The girl who once begged for scraps would be there next Saturday, and so would they. That was the promise. That was the whole story. Not the rescue, not the trial, not the verdict, the Saturdays. Every single one.